This video is a complete guide to the procedural object mod in Cities Skylines. I'm going to go over each and every function, explain some basic controls together with possible uses and some tips and techniques. This video is long, very long. There will be a thorough list of contents in the video description with timestamps, so feel free to skip to whatever topic interests you. Let's go. Before we can use the Procedural Objects mod and all of its features, we first need to convert the normal game's objects into the so-called procedural object. And there are two basic ways of doing that. The first original is to simply pick the object in Find It or any other of these tabs, and then click the button Convert to PO before you place it down. Then you can just pick the position of the object, change its rotation, height, click, and it's going to be placed. When you're done, it's going to show this plus icon, and if you hover over it, it will be highlighted. So that's a confirmation that it is now a procedural object. The second option is to use Move It. You can just select the object as you would normally do with Move It in order to just move it around. But I'm going to hit the shortcut on the keyboard, Shift P, and it's going to be converted into the procedural object. I believe that the shortcut can be changed in Move It's settings. What's great about this Move It conversion is that you can also do it for selection of objects. So for example, I can just marquee select all these buildings, hit Shift P, and they are all going to be converted into procedural objects at once. Also, what's great is that you can undo this. So just like normally you would in Move It, you're just going to press Ctrl Z and it's going to revert these buildings back into actual buildings and not procedural objects. One note about this conversion is that automatically when you do this, this PO button in Move It is going to toggle on, and it's going to add the filter PO into this list of filters. This is something that can be intentionally switched on and off, because when you do have it on, then the performance is going to be worse. You are going to lose some FPS. That's just how the mod works. So this is exactly why the button is there, so that you can turn it off when you don't need it to save some of those FPS. So I highly recommend that if you don't need it, you're just going to have it turned off. When you convert objects through Move It, they are also going to be highlighted when you open the Procedural Objects mod, which is very useful if you are converting from normal objects in like a very densely detailed area. So I, for example, converted these 5 at the back. I'm going to open the PO mod, and as you can see, they are all pre-selected like this. And no, it only happens after the conversion. If you are going to select the procedural objects through Move It and then open the Procedural Object mod, it is not going to be selected. It only works after conversion. Some buildings in the game are made of the so-called sub-buildings. Now, those are usually, for example, this Tokyo Olympic Stadium is made of sub-buildings. Those are usually the very large structures. With this particular one, you can tell that it is made of sub-buildings because it has these many different, somewhat disconnected footprint outlines when I hover over it with the mouse cursor, right? So that's dead giveaway that it is made of sub-buildings. Now, when a building is like that, you cannot fully convert it into a procedural object through the Move It approach. So if I'm just going to select it while it's already plopped down, hit Shift P, only the main mesh, the first building is going to be converted like this, as you can see. And that's not exactly what I want. So the only thing to do here would be to just convert it using the traditional approach. So before plopping it down, click the button Convert to PO. It might take a while depending on how large the structure is. As you could have seen, the game froze there for a little while, but it's, fine. Now, when you do that, some buildings are going to have the sub-buildings reoriented like this. That's unfortunate. You will have to reorient them yourself. Now, there is only a single icon in here, and as you can see, the color for the highlight is red. That means that it was converted into a group. We're going to be talking about groups later, and the conversion of sub-buildings into procedural objects needs to have this option enabled. Convert sub-buildings automatically. I believe that it is on by default, but just make sure that it is. When you convert a building into a procedural object, it's going to lose all the props and all the surfaces that are made together with it. So obviously, if I'm just going to use Move It and move this building around, it's going to be moved with all the details. And maybe you don't want them. So one use of the conversion into procedural object is to simply just get rid of these. And I'm actually using this quite a lot I don't even want to convert this building into procedural objects because I want to do some changes to it. But I just want to quickly get rid of those surfaces, because Surface Painter is not going to be all that fine for this kind of work. And if the building is made with lots and lots of props and I want to get rid of all those props for only that one building, so I cannot use Bob, for example, because Bob would be global, then I'm just going to convert it into a PO. Also, networks and all kinds of pedestrian connections are going to be lost after conversion to procedural objects. So, for example, if I have this train station and I convert it into PO, then not only are the railways going to be gone, but also all the pedestrian, the so-called pink paths that would be made in the building that are invisible, that would allow people to cross this building and into the platforms. So it's just going to be the model without any of that. Procedural objects do not have LODs. Now, LOD is that version, that lower detailed version that's going to kick in as you zoom out. And it's especially going to be noticeable for these very large buildings because they are still very large even as you zoom out. So you can change this globally with the ultimate level of detail mod. But if you just want to do it for a single building in your entire city, it doesn't really make sense, like performance-wise, to just raise that limit for the entire city. So what you might simply do is convert it into a procedural object. So I'm just going to do that quickly with move it for the one on the right. And as you can see, I'm going to zoom out. The one on the left is going to lose the detail. It's going to become the LOD. And the one on the right isn't. So, you know, that's something that, again, you cannot control it. It is just going to happen as you convert into PO, but you might use it to your advantage. So definitely don't go around the entire city and convert everything into a procedural object because of this, because you are going to have terrible FPS. But for some buildings here and there, it might actually be kind of useful. Certain objects in the game are so large that when you position a camera in a certain way, basically when you have the center of the structure, building in this particular case, it's usually going to be buildings. If you're going to have that center outside of the view, the game is just going to think that it no longer needs to show it because you are not going to be able to see it anyway. But big buildings, you will be able to see it, like this one. So this is something that procedural objects do differently. If you convert this particular building into a procedural object, it's going to not have that behavior. So again, this is something that just happens with procedural objects, and you can just convert it into a PO to stop this behavior, even if you don't want to do any additional changes. Another reason why you might want to convert a building into a procedural object is to stop the terrain from following it. So this is a normal behavior that you are probably familiar with. If you are going to place a building and maybe make it go up and down with move it, the terrain is going to follow it. But what if you, for example, want to build some kind of a residential area in the slopes of a mountain or something, and you want to have the buildings partially in the terrain? Well, you can just convert it into a procedural object and the terrain is just going to go away. And then you can just do whatever you want with the building. Move it very, very freely, independently of the terrain. Now, another reason might be to just prevent the creation of the foundation block. Now, this is technically not part of the model, this is just an extension that the game creates, and this might be not exactly all that great if you are trying to build some sort of a very densely built place and you need to have a tunnel, and specifically a tunnel entrance, and the foundation block is going to go inside of the tunnel or into whatever place you have below the building. So again, not only you're going to get rid of the terrain, but you are also going to get rid of the foundation block. Not everything can be converted into procedural objects. For example, networks, certain vanilla stuff, vanilla props, trees, and terrain conforming stuff, although there are workarounds. So for trees and vehicles, because you cannot see vehicles through Find It, there is the Tree and Vehicle Props 2 mod. As you can see, I'm only using it for vehicles, but you can also use it for trees. It's going to create a copy of a prop version of a tree. Now, the terrain conforming stuff, there is also a mod called Non-Terrain Conforming Props. You can use that, and on load, it's going to just create another version of whatever you have, but it's not going to be terrain conforming. So then you can convert it into procedural object and do whatever you want with it. And what happens if you try to convert a terrain-conforming thing into procedural objects? Well, it's basically going to disappear. Technically, it's still there. You can see the ghost, you can see the outline when you hover over the plus icon, and actually the object is there, although it is stuck, the model is stuck on the level 0 of the map. If I was to use a clipping network, you would actually be able to see it down below. But for practical reasons, this is just useless. So if you do see just this invisible ghost, you did convert something that was terrain conforming. So just delete it and use something else. So this particular fence, as you can see, I have the second version, which was converted with the non-terrain conforming props mod. And depending on how certain assets were made, you might still lose some features after the conversion into procedural objects. So don't be alarmed, this is just normal behavior. It's not really the fault of the assets, it's just how they were made for specific reasons. So this particular elevator just loses the glass enclosure. Glass is sometimes lost for other buildings as well, but that doesn't mean that glass cannot be converted. There are, for example, the glass surfaces that can be converted just fine. So for example, this one that I'm using all the time can be converted. Objects that require the additive shader can be converted into procedural objects. These are usually the holographic ads or various signs. Maybe you are not even familiar with additive shader because it's no longer needed separately because it's part of prop anarchy. But if you are using this version, that you might encounter a certain problem, and that is you are going to reload the safe, but the procedural object version of a sign like this, for example, is not going to be there. There's going to be only this plus icon symbolizing that there is something, but the actual model is not going to be visible. If you have that, then the only workaround right now is to use the old version of additive shader that's separately downloaded and loaded before procedural objects using the load order mod. I'm going to write more details in the video description about this. When you convert buildings into procedural objects, they are going to lose their functionality. So this residential building was converted into a PO and it's just a decoration now. And the same exact thing would happen to an office, school, factory, whatever. The building is just going to lose its functionality for the gameplay reasons. Now you can go around it. You can download the so-called block services made by Nylin. There is a huge pack of all different kinds of functional buildings, and they are just these little cubes that you can place down, and with Move It, you are just going to place them inside the buildings to kind of make them functional. You would obviously place them at the doors so that people are going to enter those doors. People sometimes make comments that procedural objects buildings lose illumination during the night, but they don't. They still have the illumination map and it is working. It's just a random behavior. So if your procedural object building does not light up and the normal version does, it's just a matter of time. But if an object does have a separate light source, like for example street lights or any kind of airport approach lights and timetables, for example, if they have light sources as well, they are going to lose that functionality when you convert it into procedural object, and it's not going to come back. So with the conversion out of the way, let's finally go into the mod. The button for procedural objects, by the way, can be moved wherever you want it on the screen. You are just going to right click it and drag it. Some people like to have it down here by the move it icon. I like to have it up here. I'm going to click it and I'm going to open the window for selection mode. So let's go over some basics of selection that are actually kind of important, and maybe you don't know all of them. So you're just going to left click the object's icons and you're going to select them. The icon is going to turn red. That means it's selected. So left clicking does that. Now, if I'm going to hold Control on the keyboard, then I can just add to this selection by just left-clicking all the rest of the objects. If I want to deselect them, I'm just going to click right-click somewhere else on the screen, single time. Now, if I want to select multiple objects, I'm just going to right-click and drag to have the marquee tool, and I'm going to select multiple objects. The Control also works in here, so I'm just going to hold Control and add the rest of these three and into single selection like that. So that's kind of easy, that's straightforward. Now, let's talk more about this menu that appears when I select an object. So the menu is rather big and it can sometimes obstruct the view. So for example, when I zoom out, look how it's going to completely overshadow the other icons. Now, they are still there, and you can actually select those icons still, but you have to do it through the marquee tool because you don't see them, obviously. So I'm just going to hold Control and I'm just going to select that entire area. And as you can see, when I move the camera, the buttons were, or the icons were selected. So that's something you can do, especially useful for some like heavily detailed areas. Now, what about the menu position itself? Because when I'm just going to select a couple of objects, then the menu is basically going to appear at a random position. I just selected these. For some reason, it appeared with this object. What if I don't want to have the menu appearing at this object? What if I want to appear it at this building, for example? Well, I'm just going to select it first. That's important. And then I'm going to add to this selection. And look at that. The menu is going to stay at this building. So if I want to have it at this building, I'm going to select it first. and then I'm just going to add to the selection all the rest of them, and the menu appeared here or stayed here. So that's very important for some later use as well. So let's now go over each and every one of these functions in the selection mode, starting on the left with layers. When you click that, then the layer window is going to open with the list of layers that you created. I don't have any. If you want to create a new layer, you're just going to type in something in this window, click the plus icon, and a new layer is going to be created with this eye icon and the deletion button. So if I want to put, for example, these two buildings in the layer, I'm just going to select them in the menu, click set layer, and the name of the layer. And the main point of layers is to just put objects into them and then turn the layer invisible so that you can unobstructedly just work on some kind of area. If you have like let's say a train station's roof converted into a procedural object and you want to work on the interior, you're just going to put the roof into the layers, turn it invisible, and you can just work down below. And when you are done, just turn it visible again and have the finished thing. So you're going to do that by simply clicking the eye icon, kind of straightforward. It's going to turn red like that. It's going to be crossed like this, and the objects are invisible. There are options in the menu. There is a check button there that you can disable so that you're going to have the icons still visible. I don't really find this particularly useful. I really just prefer them to be invisible like that completely. Although you might, for example, completely forget about them if it's like some small detail. So, you know, it's up to you. The possibility is there. So if you want to turn it back on, then you're just going to click the eye icon. If you want to move the objects away from the layer or into a different layer, you're just going to click set layer, click none or some different name, and that's it. If you're going to have some objects in the layer and you delete the layer when it's, for example, invisible, then it's automatically going to make the objects leave that layer and they are going to turn visible again. Then we have the measurements function. If I'm going to click that, the measurements window is going to open and it allows me to measure distances between two vertices in the mesh of the model or angle between three vertices. So let's, for example, go for this building, edit, customization, and let's just say that I want to measure the width of this window. So I'm going to click measure distances. Then I'm going to select this one vertex. It's going to turn red when I'm selecting it. And I need to click select as points. This first or the second, doesn't matter, red button. It's going to turn white. I'm going to select a second point I want to measure to, and I'm going to select that second red button. It's going to highlight that distance, as you can see over here, and it's going to write the distance in here. So it's 1.6 meters. I can just close this and it's going to automatically clear. Now, if I want to measure again, I'm just going to open the window. It's going to be cleared. It doesn't remember the previous thing. Measuring angles is exactly the same, but you're just going to select 3 points. I don't think I need to show that. Measuring can also be done between two objects. So, for example, when I want to get the distance between some kind of edges of the roof between these two buildings, then all I'm going to do is simply open the measurements tab, click measure distances, open this object, edit, customization, and for example, this little node right here, I'm going to click it, or vertex, click select as point, it's going to turn white. Then I'm just going to completely leave that edit mode. I must not shut down procedural objects. Then I'm going to go into the edit mode of this second object, customization, and for example, between the same point in here, select as point. It's going to be highlighted just like before, and it's going to show me the distance. So very useful, this one. Then we have the exported objects window, which is just going to show you a list of all the objects that you exported. I don't have any in here, but it's probably a good idea to just talk about export function in procedural objects right now. It works similar to move it with a few differences though. So I have, for example, these two buildings. If I want to export them, I'm just going to select them and click export. It's going to ask me if I want to do that as ploppable selection or fixed export. So let's just do ploppable selection first. And then I'm going to export it also as a fixed export. All right. And I'm going to delete them. Now I'm going to go into this exported objects window. I need to click refresh if I just did that without reloading the save file. And I have two options in here. I have those fixed export buildings and selection buildings. Now the selection, that is the ploppable selection. So if I click place, then it's just going to show me the buildings at the mouse cursor, and I can freely change its position, rotation, height, and everything before I place them down. Okay, So that is the ploppable selection. Now the fixed export means that I'm just going to click import, and it's going to be imported exactly into the same location that it was taken from. So, you know, that's kind of straightforward. And if I want to get rid of these exports, then I can just click this button. And if you want to export just a single object, then you're not going to have the export button in here. So you need to go into the edit window, the general tool, and in this export tab down here, you just need to type in the name of the object and hit the export button, and it is going to be exported. You can now go into the exported objects, click refresh, and it's going to be right here. So you can just place it just like before, but now you're not going to have the option to export it in place. The fourth button is the texture management. It's simply going to open a list of all your textures that you downloaded either from the workshop or imported locally into the texture folder. So there is the button to open the textures folder. You're just going to click that. It's going to open the Explorer, and you can just import all kinds of pictures into it. Then you need to click the refresh button, and it's going to appear in this list. There's like a statistic showing you how many texture packs you have in your game right now. But this is just a list. We are going to talk about textures later. Similar situation is here with this other button, that is the font management. Again, it's just a list of fonts that you downloaded from the workshop. So you can just click them and you can kind of preview them. Then we have the modules management. These are all the animations modules. This window is a little bit more useful because you can just click the module and globally disable it. For example, it's going to show you those eye icons, again, similar to layers. Then we have the render options window, and this is very important. So let's talk about rendering more generally and maybe even skip ahead to some related functions because it's kind of important that this is explained together. So what even is rendering of procedural object? It means that at some point when you zoom out, they're going to start disappearing. They're going to stop rendering, all right? They're going to completely vanish together with those selecting points. So you can't even select them. Even if I do this, they are just not going to be selected when I zoom back in. Now, back in the day, there was only one method of calculation, and that was the fixed method. It basically meant that every single procedural object disappeared at the same distance. And that was obviously bad because you would have very large buildings disappearing early on, while some small details that you would not even see anymore with the resolution would still be present and, you know, taking the hardware resources. So that's why we have the dynamic option right now, which takes into consideration the sizes of the procedural objects and makes the small objects disappear earlier. You can see that over here, the small buildings disappear, there's a huge skyscraper, is still there. There we go. That's when it disappears, when you can barely even see it, right? So that's very useful. I believe that the dynamic option is not on by default, so you need to go here and switch that. Then you have some options over here that you can just fiddle with to get some kind of a sweet spot when you are satisfied with the disappearance of the objects. And then you need to do the recalculate all render distances because, you know, when you change these, it's not going to be applied. What this window does, it's very important to understand it. So what this window does is it assigns the render distances for each and every one of these procedural objects that you have on the map. But you can change that for each and every one of these if you are not satisfied with it. So let's just say I hit some kind of a sweet spot, but I have some sort of a building, for example in Asturias series, the space elevator, that really needs to be visible no matter how far I zoom out. So I would go to that building and I would simply click it. In the menu, I would go to More, and here down here I have set render distances, and it's going to just open this little window where I can type in that render distance manually. This is not going to change the settings for the same buildings for other procedural objects. So you can really do this independently for each and every one of these buildings. You can also do that for groups of buildings, and you can also do it for selections of buildings. So if I, for example, just select all these buildings, I'm just going to click More, set render distances, and type in some kind of a number that is then going to be assigned to each and every one of these that are selected. So This is very, very useful. You obviously want to set the render distances so that you are going to have those buildings or other objects, props, especially decals, for example, disappearing when you no longer need them. Because if you just go ham with the render distance, set everything to max, then you're going to zoom out like this, and your FPS is just going to be, negative, because all the procedural objects will have these detailed versions still visible. They do not have those LODs, so it is important to play around with this. Then we have the selection filters. They are kind of straightforward. They work very similarly to the filters in Move It, for example. So I have the filter for buildings in here. That's going to allow me to select all these buildings. If I don't have the buildings filter on, by the way, if I just double click it, it's only going to select that one filter if the rest of them are selected. If I don't have that, then I don't even see the icons. I cannot touch those buildings at all. Now the picker works a little bit differently compared to Move It, and that is you can pick multiple objects. So you're going to assign a building or an object to a picker like this. You're going to click it. You're going to click this small picker button in the lower right corner, and it's going to type in the name of that object here in the brackets. So then only this object is selectable. But I can assign this one building again into the selection. I'm just going to click the picker, and look at that. Now we have two object types in picker, and we can select that. What's really important to take away from these filters, is that they translate into Move It. Now, Move It's filters by default only see procedural objects. They don't recognize what the objects used to be. So if I have, for example, the buildings filter in Move It, then I cannot select procedural object buildings. But I can go to the PO filter, and now look at that. I'm only going to select with the marquee tool. I can only select the buildings that were selected with the filter in procedural objects. So they do translate. If I'm now going to enable buildings filter in here, then I can select all of these. But if I only go for the picker options, then I can, with Move It, select only these. So this is super useful. So those were all the options in the selection mode window up here. Let's now go over each and every one of these functions down in this menu when we click a procedural object. Let's leave the edit button for later now and go over the simpler functions first. So let's start with Move To. This is very straightforward. If I'm going to click Move To, I'm just able to move the building and rotate the building and just put it into a new location. And there is actually going to be this very helpful tooltip up here, which is going to show you all the shortcuts. So I don't need to explain them. But I would like to explain one thing. Let's just say that the building is at a certain height. All right. And I would like to move this building. I would like to click Move To and put it to a different position but the same height. I'm going to click the Move To button, and the tooltip says that I need to hold H button on the keyboard, key on the keyboard, to snap to that previous height. But I'm holding it right now, and it's not snapping to the previous height. Why? Well, because the height is not stored. It needs to be stored first. So there are two options of doing that. If a building is at a certain height, then you can either copy it, so either press Ctrl+C or click the copy button, and then when I'm going to click Move To, it is, after holding H, going to snap to this height. All right? So that is the first option. Now the second option, when the building is at a certain height, is to go into that edit mode. And there, this button, Store Height, I'm going to click it. And now, when I'm going to move it, I'm going to hold H, and it is going to be snapped to that height. This Move To command can be reverted. So if I'm going to click it, put the building into a different height, a different position, orientation, then I can simply then go into the Edit mode, click the Edit button, and without touching any of these buttons in here, I'm simply going to press Ctrl+Z. Just like in Move It, and it's going to revert that command. So all the rotations, position changes, everything. Then we have the copy button, which is going to allow me to do a copy of this object. So I can just click the button or press Ctrl+C, which is also going to store the height, as I explained with Move To function. And then I can press Ctrl+V to place the copy. If I'm going to hold H, then it's going to snap to the same height. Here we have the same tooltip as for the Move To tool, because it's exactly the same. So I'm just going to place the copy, and what if I want to copy paste a selection? That's kind of straightforward. I'm just going to select it, but watch where the menu is. It's at this building. I'm going to press Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and at the mouse cursor, I am going to have that building where the menu was. But what if I don't want that? What if I, for example, have some sort of decals, for example, cobblestone decals, and I would like to select them, copy paste them. But let's just say I want to extend it in this direction and I want to match the pattern. I would really like to zoom in on that connection on the left, but I have the rightmost object as the focus on the mouse cursor, so I'm kind of running out of screen if I want to zoom in on that detail, so I cannot do that. I would really like to have the focus on the left. Well, how can I do that? Well, of course, with that selection trick, like I explained earlier. So I'm just going to select it first. I'm going to force the menu to appear at this object instead, and then I'm going to hold Control and marquee select all the rest. The menu is going to stay, Control C, Control V, and now as the focus, there is that leftmost decal. Then we have the set layer button, we already talked about it. More button is going to open more functions. We will deal with those later. Let's just finish this first. So we have the delete button. If you're going to click that, then you're going to simply delete the procedural object, but it's going to first show you this confirmation window because deletion of procedural objects cannot be reversed. And it also cannot be reversed through move it. So if you have the filter for buildings and you're just going to delete a building through move it, then you can obviously put it back with Control Z. But if you're going to select procedural objects with move it, delete them, then it's also going to show you the confirmation window where it clearly says that they cannot be undeleted. So be careful about that. Then we have that picker button in the corner, we already talked about it. And the last thing here in the lower left corner is the color window, which is going to quickly allow me to recolor this building or any other procedural object, depending on how that object was made. So for example, this particular building, we can recolor it as a whole because the color map is on the entire texture. So if I'm just going to move this selector around, I can just select any kind of color. It's completely going to change the color of the entire thing. Now this color, I can store it for later using this store button. Do not click these white windows. If you do, it's just going to turn the color into white. All right, so you need to actually select the color like here in the selector, then click store button, and it's going to assign it to one of these 5 buttons, right, that you can later call back. So if I have it white, I click that red stored color and it's going to go back. I believe that these are reset after a reload though, so be careful about that. But it's not going to reset the building that is assigned to the building. So if you, for example, go back to a save file and it's completely reset, which again, I'm not really sure if it happens. I think it does. Then just click the store button again and it's going to assign it to a new window. So depending on how the assets are made, for example, this asset only has the recolorable walls and not the roof. This is exactly the same as recoloring through the repaint mod of buildings, for example, or props with move it. But if you want to recolor the roof, then you can do it. But we are going to talk about it later with the texture customizations. You might sometimes encounter a situation where you need to recolor or put some kind of a color on the procedural object, and then the same color needs to be applied to, let's say, a network, like for example this surface network, the asphalt, right? But how are you going to do that? Because different mods are used to recolor these different objects, right? So how can you actually get the color code? That's actually quite simple. So all you need to do is choose your color that you want to do. Then you are going to export this object. So I'm just going to call this one color and export it. Now you're going to go into the folder where the exported objects are for procedural objects. So that would be the app data, local, colossal order, city skylines, procedural objects, exported objects. And then you're going to open that text file, which is storing all the information about that object. So that is this one. And right here, you're going to have the color value. Now, these are not written in the usual format you might be familiar with from 0 to 255, but these are basically percentages of the 255. So all you need to do is simply multiply these numbers by 255 and you will get that usual RGB color code. So let me quickly do that. Okay, so after rounding this would be 192, 29, and 29. You obviously need to round it because you are going to usually get some kind of decimal numbers. But anyway, Now you can easily just go back into City Skylines and, for example, use the repaint mod. So for this building, for example, that's kind of straightforward. You probably already are familiar with. And you're just going to type it in these numbers or in these windows. So 192, 29, 29. And I can, for example, copy that color and I can apply it with the shortcut of the repaint mod onto this network. For some reason, it did not copy, but I can just type it in. There we go. And it's exactly the same color. So this might apply to, as you can see, buildings, or for example, if you have procedural object surfaces and you want to have some kind of network surfaces right next to each other. This is what I'm using in Asturias for those green surfaces, for example, then this is very handy. Then we have the More button, which is just going to open another menu with lots more functions. So let's just go over them. First, we have these align heights and align rotations. Now, by the way, these buttons are also going to show you the shortcut for these functions. By default, I believe that they don't have any, so you need to set them up. And I really recommend that, especially the align heights and rotations, you are going to set to some kind of shortcuts, preferably the same shortcuts as in Move It, because the functions are exactly the same. Now that we are here, I also have shortcuts for align between two objects because I use it, and recenter object origin, all right? But you can just assign shortcuts for, I believe, all of those functions in that More menu. So it's very straightforward. If you have, for example, this building right here, and you want to align height to this one, I'm just going to press the shortcut. It's going to align the height. This can be reverted, and you need to go into the Edit menu, just like before, and press Ctrl Z. All right, it's going to just revert that. So align rotation works exactly the same. Press the shortcut, align rotations. There we go. If I want to revert it, I need to go to Edit, press Ctrl Z. Now, if I want to do it for a selection, then I can. I can just select all these buildings, press Ctrl H for my height alignment shortcut, and all of these are going to be aligned. But it cannot be reverted for all of them at once, because you cannot go into edit mode for all of these objects. That's not supported just yet. So if I press Ctrl Z while having them selected, nothing happens. I need to go into each and every one of these, into edit modes, and press Ctrl Z, as you can see, to revert it. The align rotation function in procedural objects works exactly the same as the rotate in place function in Move It. This means that, for example, if I'm going to turn these two buildings, if I'm going to select them and align rotation for this one, for example, then it's not going to rotate the selection as a whole, but only the each individual buildings. If you would like to turn them as a whole, you just need to use Move It. You need to, again, just select them in Move It and rotate it, for example, to this building. Yeah, and it's going to do that linear rotation. Then we have the functions equal slope and align between two objects. And these might seem like they do the same thing in certain situations, but they don't. So let me illustrate what exactly this means. So the equal slope, if I'm going to, for example, have like a 3D selection of objects, so for example, all of these, and I'm going to hit the equal slope function, then first, I can either go for equal slope or oriented equal slope. Let's just go for equal slope, the simpler one. You can see how this works. It basically projects like a plane between the faraway objects of that selection. So this works similarly to that function in Move It, which is also calculating this plane that all the objects are going to go to. Now, if you want to undo all of this, then unfortunately, again, you have to go for each and every one of these objects and just put it back. Or I can obviously just select all of these buildings, press Ctrl H, and just shift them back to a certain height. The oriented equal slope is going to do exactly the same thing, except it's also going to turn the buildings or the procedural objects so that their local coordinates are going to be exactly parallel. The horizontal axes are going to be on that virtual plane that was calculated between those objects on the outer edges of this selection. So, you know, this can also be useful in some situations. And this can also be reverted if you are just going to go into the edit modes of the objects and press Ctrl Z. The align between two objects function works only on a line. It doesn't calculate any surface or anything like that. It just works as a line, straight line between two objects. So if I have, for example, these, I'm going to select them, go into more, align between two objects, and it's going to ask me between what objects. So let's just say that I want to just align between the outermost. So this red one on the left and on the right, this one. And, you know, it's just going to do what you would kind of expect it to do. What it's not going to do is it's basically going to create like a perpendicular line into that ideal line, and it's just going to shift that object into it. So it's not going to equally space them out on that line, all right? So that's not what this function does. But this function is a little bit interesting in certain ways. By the way, you can also revert this. Again, go to edit mode of each and every one of these objects and do that. What this mode also does is it creates like an extension of that. So watch what happens if I, for example, have all of these other buildings, and I'm going to go for the align between two objects, but I'm, for example, only going to select these two. All right. So it's basically going to create a line between those two objects, and it's going to extend it past that line. And it's going to align all these other objects into that line using that same technique. So it's just going to shift them perpendicularly to that line. So this is, you know, just something to remember. I suppose if you are using these functions, you kind of need to know how they function. And this could be super useful if you are detailing, for example, some kind of a street, and you're only going to do a single segment, and it's just going to extend, you know, all the rest of the way. And this, of course, also works vertically. So if I have this, I'm going to go align between two objects, then it's just going to align them like this, not just horizontally, but also vertically. And if you would like to evenly space out these buildings, then you can simply go to move it, go for the PO filter, and just, you know, I have it set on Control A, for example, shortcut, to use that even spacing function in move it. And this is something that I'm doing all the time these days. So I'm just going to have some sort of an object, like a pillar, for example. I'm going to carefully position the starting one, then the end one, and then just going to randomly place the number of those objects that I know I want to use. I'm going to click one, go for picker, I'm going to go for move it, select all of them, press my shortcut for equal spacing, and there we go. Snap to ground function is going to work as we would expect. If I'm going to press it, it's going to ask me to snap to ground. Well, yeah, I want to. And it's going to snap the origin point, basically the plus icon, to ground. As you can see, this particular model was already rotated, so it's partially going to be sunk because the origin point was above those parts of the texture. So that's important to remember, that the origin point gets snapped to ground. So, for example, I have this building over here, which has the origin point completely wrong. It just has it like well below the building. What happens if I snap it to ground? Well, it's going to snap the origin point to ground, which is going to leave the rest of the building flying like this. So that's something to really keep in mind, how this function works. This leads me to the recenter object origin function. I have it set for a shortcut because I'm using it all the time. This means that if I'm going to click it, then it's going to put the origin point to the lowest coordinate of the lowest vertex in the local coordinates. This means that when the building is rotated like this, in global coordinates, I suppose that this corner of the building would be the lowest, but the point is not going to be snapped to that. It's going to be snapped to this one, and it's more particularly going to be snapped, I suppose, to like a geometrical center between those lowest points. At least it makes sense in this particular case. So I'm just going to use this kind of function, and now if I wanted to snap it to ground, then it's going to behave similarly to this building. Although there is a difference, because as you can see, this building has this like a foundation block. This is not created by the game, this was created by the asset creator, and by default, when you convert this building into procedural objects, the origin point is going to be at the bottom of the door on top of the foundations. All right, that's going to be the level 0. That was the level 0 in Blender, where the asset creator made the asset. But this function, as you can see, the foundation block changed texture because it's just assigned by the game, but the mesh isn't. And if I'm going to recenter the object origin, it's going to be placed on the bottom of that of the mesh, of the actual mesh. Ploppable surfaces, like this ploppable asphalt, for example, is a little bit specific because it doesn't have just these 4 vertices in the corners, but it also has this vertex down here and this vertex up here. So if I'm going to recenter the object origin for this one, look at that. It's moved to like a lot lower because it's going to move to the vertical coordinate of this outlying node. I'm not really sure why this node is necessary. I suppose there is a reason for that, but it's again just something to remember. So if I have some sort of an outlying node that would be maybe even invisible, if I have, I don't know, for example, this, and I'm going to recenter the object origin, then it's really going to be recentered to that lowest vertex, all right? So keep that in mind. Then we have the randomized rotation, which is similar to move its function, except you can select all 3 axes. So the axis that is selected is in red, it's by default Y, that's the same as in move it, but you can also add X and Z axes. Okay, so let's move to the second column of the more functions, and here we are going to start from the bottom with the color gradient. So this is a useful little feature where you are simply going to select multiple objects, and you can recolor them so that the first and the last objects are going to have the color that you set in here, and the rest of the objects in the middle between them are just going to have the gradient. Now, what object is going to be the first and the last? If you imagine this selection, then it's not really a square, so it has like 2 objects that are like the furthest apart, so those are going to be the first and last, all right? So it doesn't matter how you turn this around or something, it's just going to be like that. So for example, when I for example include this building in that, then it should have the gradient turned 90 degrees basically, and it does. Yeah, look at that. This one is obviously going to work. It's working with the distances, right? So if the buildings in this particular case are not having the same distances between each other, then all the blue is lost because the blue gradient would be in this empty space. So it doesn't really apply it evenly between the objects, but distance based. If you want to remove the gradient after it's been already applied, you can simply go to the recoloring tool and just, fiddle with it a little bit, put it back to white. Now, one thing to note is that if you go into the color gradient, you're going to apply some kind of color and then go back to it again, then those colors are gone. So if you later want to do some changes, you have to store the colors, all right? So it might be a good practice if you are doing this a lot to simply just store the colors every time you do some changes, so you that then later can recall them. We already mentioned set render distances, so let's go for select texture. This is going to allow you to change the diffuse texture of any procedural object. So it's going to open this window that we already saw with the texture management, although in here you are actually going to select the texture. So I have some downloaded from the workshop, some uploaded locally. Let's, for example, go for this. I'm not really sure what that is, some kind of a wooden texture, and it's just going to replace everything on the diffuse texture of this particular building. Now, it's not going to replace the normal map, illumination, color, or any other maps. So the windows are going to stay on the specular map, and also some details that were part of the normal map. So in this particular case, we still have these like shadowy outlines of the bricks. Now, obviously for buildings, this is not like super useful, but if you are working with some kind of more basic shapes, like for example this pillar, and you would like to turn it into just some kind of a different material, like this wood or something else, then that's actually going to work much better. Even though there are still going to be some normal map artifacts on it, or remnants, I suppose. If you're going to, choose even simpler items, then you can turn them into something completely different. If you want to delete that, if you want to revert back, then you are simply going to go to select texture and this big button none. And some objects are simply going to take the texture change better than others. If I, for example, apply the wooden texture on this building, it's just going to turn orange, because the way the texture was made originally on this building is that there is only a tiny part of the diffuse that is stretched over the entire facade. So you are not going to be able to see the actual structure of the wood in this particular case. And right now we can only do this change for the entire model. We cannot, for example, apply it to some specific parts. Applying textures is actually something that you need to do with certain objects before you place them down as procedural objects. That is, for example, the case of these basic shapes and even these letters, actually. So if I have, for example, this cube and I convert it into a procedural object, it's immediately going to ask me to put a texture on it. So I need to choose something like, well, yeah, let's just continue with this wooden texture, for example. And these objects cannot be converted through move it. So this is a prop. I'm just going to select it, press Shift P, and nothing's happening. It's not going to change the object at all. So keep that in mind, that's what's happening. And here I would like to skip a little forward, because this is connected to a different function. And that is, if you're going to go into the edit mode and into advanced addition tools, then down here you have texture tiling, and this is going to be only visible with these particular shapes that require the application of texture before conversion. So this is very useful, because this is basically going to allow you to change the different options for stretching or applying the texture on the surface. The tiling factor is especially useful. As you can see, you can just make the texture larger or smaller, and then you have the different options for like repeating the pattern of the texture or simply just stretching it on the entire face, right? So that is very useful, for example, if you have a texture with some kind of a text or any other shapes, signs, or patterns that just need to retain a certain aspect ratio. So for example, this particular texture, now I have it set to stretch, which means that the text is going to be on the entire face, kind of. And if I'm going to switch it to repeat and switch the tiling factor to, different values, then it's just going to be repeated. Replace by copy is a huge function that I'm using all the time. Probably one of my favorites, because it's really saving a lot of time. So let's just say that I have some of these buildings and I want to do some change for the vertices. So for example, I want to make this building like this, all right? Now I want to make these two buildings exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to press Ctrl C on the original, then go for these two. I can either go for one or selection, doesn't matter. And then I'm just going to go for replace by copy. It's going to show me a confirmation because this cannot be reverted. And I'm going to click yes. And it's going to place the original into these. It's basically going to copy paste the original into the position of these two. And it's going to delete the previous two. So that also means that these are completely new procedural objects. So for example, if I'm going to go into this one, I can revert this, but I cannot revert it in here because these are new objects. They do not have any history of changes to revert to, all right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now, we can also convert it, or we can copy it into completely different objects. It doesn't need to be the same object. So for example, these. I'm just going to copy it into those. And as you can see, it's going to retain the orientation and also height. Let me show you. It's also going to retain the height, orientation and height of those objects. So the origin point is going to stay exactly the same. All right. So let me, for example, show you this. When I'm going to do this, so now that the origin point is over here and the actual object is over here. If I'm now going to replace the copy, then the origin point is going to stay exactly where it was, but there's now going to be the copy, all right? So it is going to keep the origin points. That's just something to remember when using this. Now, for example, buildings, right? The buildings, you cannot really place buildings in some sort of patterns like a line or circles, but you can do that with props. Let's, for example, take a light, some kind of a simple prop, and let's go for the circle mode in the prop line tool, which is part of prop anarchy. And let's just create like a nice circle. I'm going to play with some of the details. I'm, for example, going to go for some larger spacing. I have some specific angle in here, and I'm just going to create like a circle. What I can do now, this is exactly the same technique that I used in the Asturias video recently. I'm just going to convert these lights into procedural objects. I'm going to go for this building, or actually this one. I already have it in the clipboard, so I don't need to do it. I'm just going to select the street lights and replace by copy. And now I'm going to have buildings in this particular shape. So this is extremely useful if you are trying to do some kind of circular patterns with buildings. You can even do lines, of course, or obviously curves with the prop line tool. But mostly I'm using this particular feature of procedural objects so that when I have some sort of a, well, for example, this kind of a pattern, this circular pattern, and I want to make a change with one detail, like for example this railing, I just want to move it a little bit, then I would have to do it for every single one of these buildings, right? I don't need to. All I need to do is just copy paste it in. So I would just select all of them, even together with the original, doesn't matter if I don't want to revert those changes like I mentioned, and just replace by copy. And now every one of these is going to have the exact same change. Project function is a really interesting function, one of the newer in procedural objects, and it's really powerful. So what does it do? Well, it basically just takes the entire mesh and the entire model and just squashes it in a certain direction in the global coordinates. Unfortunately, right now it only works with global coordinates. Hopefully, later it's going to be allowed in local. But anyway, what are these controls? So here you have the controls for the axes. Projection force is basically how much it squashes. So 0, nothing, 100% completely, right? So you probably don't want that, I suppose. The projection offset is simply the offset from the surface where the squashing plane is going to be. Then there's the button if you want this to collide with networks and buildings, and that is probably something insanely powerful. Let me show you why. If you're going to click cancel, then nothing is going to happen. So look what happens when I have something a bit more useful, for example a building and props, like this green ivy. So I already somewhat stretched it so that it's going to be a bit visible because it's by default very small. And I'm going to go for the plus X, and I'm going to fiddle some with some of these settings with the projection offset, and let's lower the projection force. And I'm basically going to make this green ivy fit that curvature of the building. Look at that from the top. It's very visible, like, right? So this is exactly where the projection function really shines, with these kinds of details that you can then squash on the buildings, on the irregular surfaces of the buildings. In here I have, for example, this poor cat that I'm able to just completely splat on the surface of the building. So I'm just going to go for project. I can also squash it on the surface like that, if you want to be morbid maybe, and do it on a network. But you can just do it like this on the building. So you can do this with some of those hollow ads. You can do this with any kind of signs, symbols, advertisements, or just anything. The projections cannot be reverted, so be careful with that. The Distort transformation, when you first click it, it's going to create this like an outline, the bounding box of the entire object. And what this means is that now you have these vertices on the edges of the object, and you can just take those and move them freely around, and it's going to automatically move the rest of the vertices of the mesh to stick to the bounding box, to conform to the bounding box like this. So you can very quickly and very, very easily do some basic changes to shapes of these buildings. Now be careful, because if you are going to apply this, if you're going to click OK, you cannot revert it in some cases. Sometimes I was able to revert it, sometimes not. But when you are inside this mod, still you can press Ctrl Z and it is going to be reverted. So, you know, just keep that in mind, that's how it is. So you can just simply do some, you know, crazy things like I did there, or you can just do it to quickly just change some basic shapes of the building. And this is more useful for some of the more basic elements, like for example this concrete wall. It's made of a couple of vertices. If I wanted to stretch it, I would have to fiddle with just selecting all the vertices. But if I want to just very quickly, for example, increase its height, I'm just going to use the Distort tool, but it's especially useful if I want to do some of these like non-standard shapes, right? So this is really nice. Now, what's this good for is also if you want to fill some kind of non-standard shaped corners in, for example, some builds where you are trying to do like a, I don't know, some kind of European old city where you don't really have 90-degree corners, and you would really like to fit the buildings to the corners to exactly match, you know, those empty spaces between the roads. So you can, for example, do this. Certain buildings are going to work better with this tool. This particular one does really well with the tool because it's going to have the bare walls in here. They are going to take the change very well. The roof is going to be a bit distorted, but you can just put your own grass on top of it. You can then fiddle, of course, with some of more details, but you know, it was very quick to do this. You can also do all of this to groups of object. I would, for example, do something like this so that the tops are perfectly flat, but the bottoms aren't, right? They are just following some kind of weird shapes like that. As you can see, the entire box is all around the entire selection, so it's going to distort different objects differently. So if I stretched it in this corner, it's going to stretch these buildings more than these ones. So if you have a line of buildings, then you can, for example, do something like this. This is what I used in Asturias some time ago, where I used like commercial buildings that are arguably looking a tiny bit better with this distort function, of course, than these residential buildings, but you probably get the point, right? So I just have perfectly flat roof, but the rest of the building is following the road. If you make a selection of multiple objects, then a new button is going to appear, and that is the Make group. If I'm going to click it, then at the position of the menu, that's going to be the root object of the group, and all the rest of the icons are going to disappear because they are now grouped under this single one. So there are now two new buttons, Enter Group or Explode Group. Explode Group basically just dissolves it, nothing more to that. And Enter Group, I'm going to enter it. Now, right now, I have all the rest of these objects on the map, but if I'm going to enter the group, all the rest of the icons on the entire map are temporarily going to disappear. So this is very useful if you are working in, again, like a heavily detailed area with lots of small procedural objects. You are just going to put into a single group something similar, so you can just quickly, you know, highlight it and work on that, select those particular objects. Now there are some specifics related to groups. So there is, for example, the filter. So in the filters you have the filter for groups. If I'm going to have that, then only that group is going to be selected, and it doesn't matter what's inside the group. If it's props, surfaces, buildings, decals, it's just going to be the group that's selected, all right? So it's kind of like a super filter in a way. Now, when I'm going to be going into the group, I have this option to change group root. That is, if I'm going to click it, I'm just able to select a different object. For example, this brown building in here, just going to click it. Nothing is really going to happen. When I leave the group, it's going to be that selector right there. So that moved. Now, I can also change the root kind of simply by just exploding the group like this. And just like before, I'm going to select that building or that object where I want to have that root. I'm going to select it first and then just marquee select, holding control, add another ones, make group, and there we go. Now we have this one selected. When you're going to copy paste things inside a group, then they are automatically going to be included in it. So if I'm going to enter it and, for example, take these two buildings, copy paste them somewhere, then they are going to be part of that group still. I'm going to leave it, and as you can see, they are still highlighted inside of it. You cannot copy outside of the group. You would have to explode it. Now, what happens if I, for example, want to merge two groups? I can easily do that. I can simply create these two groups side by side. I'm just going to select both of them, and instead of having those usual buttons, I have the button of making a group. And again, the root is going to be the building with the menu. The filter for groups doesn't really work with Move It. If you are going to have that selected in Procedural Objects and then go to Move It, then you are going to be able to select that root object, but if you're going to move it, then you're just going to move that. So yeah, Move It doesn't work with groups. Some of the other Procedural Objects functions work and apply to the entire group. Some functions don't work at all, and some work slightly differently. So we have, for example, the recoloring. I can just with a single button, recolor the entire group. the buildings doesn't even need to be close. They can be just all over the map, of course. And then we have some others. So for example, move, I can just move to, a different locations. If I'm going to Control C, Control V, the entire group, then it is going to make a copy of a new group, basically, just like that. I can also just delete the group like that. I cannot use the picker, even though it's like 1 or 2 objects, so that's not possible. Then, for example, we have the more function. So align heights works. That's just going to align, the heights of the entire group. But the align rotations is now going to work exactly the same as the align rotations in move it. And it is going to move the entire group. Look at that. It's just not going to turn them in place, the objects, but it's actually going to rotate them as you would kind of expect. So that's also kind of useful. Equal slope doesn't work. Align between 2 objects, it's not really going to work because it's going to ask you to select those 2 objects. So, you cannot do anything about that. Snap to ground is of course going to work. That's kind of straightforward. Randomized rotation is very useful in this case because it is actually going to turn it, just like with the align rotations, it's going to turn it together. So you can randomize the groups together, which might be useful for some kind of detailing. If you have like group of certain objects that you put together, some kind of decorative rocks that they kind of work in a certain configuration or something. So this might be useful. Or if you have like a table and for example some chairs around it, or like details around the table that they need to relatively to the table need to stay the same, then that could be useful. Distort works with groups. Project also works with groups, as you can see. Select texture also applies to the entire group, so that's nice. And set render distances also. Color gradient also works for the entire group. You can just change the color gradient just like before. Now let's finally go into the edit mode. So we are going to select the object and in the menu hit the first button, edit. And this is going to move us into the so-called general tool. This window is going to change. By the way, you have some controls. If you're going to click this arrow, then there is a helpful tooltip for some keyboard shortcuts. You are first going to be greeted by this Gizmo, and this is going to be your main tool for changing the position, orientation, and scale of the building. So let's go over that. The position change is straightforward. You are just going to left click and drag some of these axes, as you can see, and it's going to snap to those axes and you can just move around the building, the object. A similar situation is with rotation. You're just going to click the rotation button, the second one, middle one, and you can then click and drag the axes just like that. Same thing with the scale. The scale looks similar to position, except it has these yellow boxes at the ends, and that's just going to allow you to scale from the origin point, all right? What's great about the Gizmo these days is that you can actually type in the values. So for example, if I want to move the building on this red axis, then as you can see, it's going to show me the window. When I'm clicking and dragging it, it's going to show me the window with the distance. It's only going to show the positive values, but clearly when we are doing a positive change, it means we are moving it towards the axis, right? So in this direction, and this would be the minus direction, the negative direction. That's important because we can type in the values. So for example, if I want to move the building some 10 meters in this direction, I'm simply going to hold that axis without moving the mouse, and I'm going to type in 10 on the keyboard and click enter, all right? And that's just going to move it in that direction. If I want to move it back, well, I can obviously undo it, but if I move it back, then I need to type -10, enter, all right? So that's kind of important, of course. And the minus plus values are because of the orientation of the axes. Similar thing is with the orientation. You can also simply type in the values of degrees. So for example, 90 degrees and -90 degrees, or in any of these other axes, doesn't matter. And you can undo it. Scaling, same thing. If I want to scale it in this axis again, then I'm just going to type in the X amount for the scaling. So I, for example, want to scale it 3 times. So just type 3, and it's very important that you don't move the mouse while you are typing it, because when you type it and then move the mouse, then it's going to delete that input, right? So you need to type in 3 again and hit enter. For position and orientation, you can also switch between local space and world space. This basically means local and global coordinates. Global means coordinates of the entire map. Now, local coordinates are always going to be according to the buildings. So, for example, right now I have the gizmo for position like this, but if I'm going to turn the building, maybe like that, and then I turn to position, then it's going to turn the gizmo together with the building. So right now, it would actually be really difficult to, for example, move the building up and down, right, with this vertical axis. So I can simply switch to the world space, and then I'm going to be able to just move the building up and down like this, or horizontally along these axes. The same thing applies to rotation. I can also just rotate the building along the vertical axis now for the global coordinates. So I can keep the local orientation, and then I can just turn it with the global orientation. The Move To button is exactly the same as in the previous menu, so we already talked about it. Now, there is the very useful feature of copying using the gizmo. So, if you are going to click and drag one of the axes, then you can also hold the Control button on your keyboard, and it's going to keep the original position of that building, of this object, and it's also going to create a copy wherever I'm going to move it. So I'm just going to let go of the mouse button while still holding Control. That's very important. You have to hold Control all the way. And it's going to create a copy where I dragged it to. Now, this distance was stored. So when I'm now going to hold Control and click and drag this axis, it's going to, as you can see, snap to that previous distance, and it's going to say repeat previous movement. So I can just do that, and I can just very easily copy infinite number of copies in here with exactly the same spacing. So that's super useful. There is also a second option in here, and that is you can simply hold Control, drag the axis, and then press Shift. Now you can let go of Shift and Control, and this is going to lock that distance between the origin and the copy, and you can just create infinite number of copies like this with exactly the same spacing. You're just going to let go of the mouse button, and it's going to apply. This, of course, also applies to the vertical axis. So, for example, if I'm going to drag this one, I'm just going to drag it, I'm going to hold Control, and then press Shift, and now I can do this. And you can also do this with specific values for the distances. So let me, for example, go back into the measurements mode. I'm going to go into the customization mode just so I can measure how wide the building is. So I'm going to click Measure Distances, click this point, click this point, and it's 8 meters wide, this building, all right? So now I'm going to go into the General tool, and I'm just going to click this red axis. I'm going to drag it. I'm going to type in -8 because I am moving it in the negative direction. I'm not going to move the mouse. I'm going to hold Control, press Shift, and now I can just move this, I'm actually going to just copy paste this building wall to wall. This is insanely powerful for these kinds of cobblestone or any kind of tile surface decals. So these are usually the sizes of powers of 2, mostly 8 meters, some are 4 and 16. I believe that this one is 8. So I would just like to copy paste it on this row. So I'm just going to go for the blue axis. I'm of course moving it in the negative direction again. So -8, hold Control, press Shift, and there we go. I can just easily copy paste this decal so that it's perfectly going to align with the neighbor. And if you are not satisfied with the gizmo, how it's obstructing the view sometimes, then you can simply go to the options and switch the gizmo opacity. So I can, for example, put it to something like 30%. And then when I'm going to go back into the edit mode, the gizmo is going to be this opaque. You can also change the gizmo size. If you are used to detailing with some small objects, then you can simply make it smaller. In the general tool window, we have the controls button. This is just going to show you a tooltip with some kind of shortcuts that you can use. Then we have the positions values. These are the global coordinates. So if you were to put 0, 0, 0 in here, it would just put it in the center of the map on level 0. You can type in these values. So for example, if you want to put the object to a specific height, if you are, for example, detailing some kind of area and you know exactly the heights where you would like to have that object, then you can do that. There is also the button for snapping to ground that works exactly like the functions before, and there is the store height button that is for the move to function, as we talked about it before again. Then there is the rotation. This is also global coordinates or global values for the rotation. These are in degrees, these are in meters, and these are in degrees. And you can also just type in these values. So you can type in the y coordinate, you can apply all these different values. This is especially useful if you want to quickly, for example, do these 90-degree changes. If you want to turn a pillar into a beam, then you just type in 90 in here and be done with it. There is also the button for resetting orientation. You have to be out of focus from that window that you just changed, as you can see. Just going to click that and it's going to put all of it back to 0. Manually changing the position numbers is also very useful when you have some kind of overlapping procedural objects, like this, for example, where you're going to notice the fighting of the texture when you move the camera. So in this case, if I don't want to have that roof texture fighting, I would go into this Y position window and I would, for example, delete these last 3 decimal numbers. Yeah, I would just put it to 0. You are not even going to notice that the procedural objects have different height, but the texture fighting stops. Then we have the material section, and this is very important. This is exactly that function that allows you to put texts on procedural objects as well as color rectangles onto specific parts of the texture. There is also this button on the right, which is exactly that function from before. That's the selection of texture for the entire model. So this is what we've already seen. I can, for example, change this building to these bricks. If I want to get rid of that, I'm just going to click the huge button, None. So let's go into the text customization. This is going to open this very big window that you can resize using this small button in the lower right corner. And you can also, in the opposite corner, you can just change the zoom level of the entire texture. This is basically showing you the diffuse texture of that asset. And now you can apply a text field on it or a color rectangle. So let's start with the text field. I'm just going to click that button here, plus add text field, and I'm going to click anywhere inside of this window. So for example, over here. Now here I'm going to type something on this texture, as you can see, and it's going to appear somewhere on the texture, depending on how the texture is done, of course. Just like with the texture change, it's going to just work better with different objects. This particular building is made so that this entire back face is done like this on the diffuse, so it's going to be a little bit easier to do the text, of course. Now you can change the color of the text. You can click that color button we are already familiar with. You have the storing options, so this is translated to the rest of the color changes in the entire mod. Now then we have the position window. You can just type in these numbers over here, or you can just click that object inside the texture and just move it around. As you can see, it's also moving on the actual building. Then we have the size, so that's just going to increase the size of the text. Spacing is going to increase the spaces between letters, and scaling is just going to stretch the text in X and Y coordinates. This is especially useful, not really for this particular asset, but if for some reason there is a texture where it's already squashed or stretched, then you can kind of make sure that the text is going to look good after it's applied. Then we have the font selection, so that's exactly from that font manager. In here you are just going to select the font. You cannot preview it at this point, so you can do that in that font manager though. Certain fonts, of course, cannot have that normal bold italic selection. Some fonts do have that. In this particular case, the text is mirrored, as you can see, and unfortunately there is nothing we can do about that. So you would have to mirror the entire building, but I'm going to show you that later. Adding texts is probably the most useful feature for these kinds of signs. You can download from the workshop all kinds of blank signs like highways or timetables for train stations or things like that, where they are intended for exactly this function. So I don't know, if I, for example, wanted to add like a 20 kilometers sign for the downtown highway sign, then I can just do it just like this. I would play with the spacing. I would try to pick the right font for this. I would like to maybe tone it down a little, as you can see, to match the colors, and overall just play around with it like that. So when you're gonna add a text field or a color rectangle later, you can copy paste them and put them even between different objects. So for example, with this particular text field, I can click this little button for copying, and then I can click this button up here to put the copy into this object. So for example, I can just copy paste the same thing in here, and then I can just move it around so that something would be above something else, and so on and so on. So that's kind of straightforward. So for example, if I'm going to copy the 20-kilometer sign, I can easily just go back into this building, into text customization, and just copy it over here. It's going to have the same values for that previous object, which means that it's obviously going to appear differently on this new object. So you would have to, move it around, put it in some different places. You can also lock all of these layers or all of these objects or signs and fields, and then you cannot click them and move them around anymore. So, that's kind of useful. This middle button is simply going to make a quick copy of that field. So as you can see, I'm going to click it and it's just going to create the same thing again. Then we have the color rectangle function, and this can have many uses. So let's, for example, say that I would like to make this building brighter. It's not like this particular building needs it, but let's just say that it's very dark from the workshop, or you want to just make it fit together with some different buildings that are brighter for some reason. Now, I cannot do that through this color thing, because I can only make the building darker. Or, for example, if the building has a color map, like this one, and you can only change the color of certain part of it, but not whole. So this tool cannot be used for that. I'm going to go into Edit Text Customization. I'm going to add Color Rectangle. Just like with the text field, I'm going to click somewhere. That's going to define the upper left corner, and then I need to just move the mouse cursor to define the lower right corner. This doesn't really matter if you want to apply it to the entire texture, like I want to do now, because I'm just going to put the rectangle somewhere, then I'm going to go into the position numbers in here, I'm just going to type in 0. Because I want to have it in the corner of the texture, right, the start. Then the widths and heights, I'm just going to click these very convenient buttons, max. And that's just going to stretch the width and height for the entire thing. Then I'm going to decrease the opacity, which is just going to make the color rectangle opaque so that it's going to show the underlying original texture some more. Obviously, if I'm going to increase this, then the original texture is going to be visible less and less. So yeah, for example, if I wanted to just a tiny bit make this building a little bit brighter, I'm going to just move the opacity. I'm not going to even touch the color, I'm just going to leave it completely white. And I'm just going to move the opacity to something like 5% or, just a touch brighter, I would do that. So that's one use of the color rectangle. Now let's say that I would like to recolor the roof of this building. So I would need to put the color rectangle on a specific place on the diffuse texture. But the diffuse texture, as you can see over here, is very dark, and I can't exactly see where the roof texture is. So I would do the same thing as before. I would simply use the color rectangle, stretch it over the entire diffuse, put the opacity somewhat lower, and then just gradually increase it, and look at that. The entire texture is going to light up like this very nicely, and it's going to show me all its features. So I don't want to keep this color rectangle, I'm just using it to highlight the texture so I can make a decision where to put that final color rectangle. And I suppose that I'm just going to zoom in. This part of the texture is most likely the roof. Now, by the way, when you are doing these color rectangle changes, the FPS is going to tank, absolutely tank. That is normal, so don't be alarmed. When you are going to be not doing these changes anymore, the FPS is going to go back, so that's fine. So I would delete this color rectangle because I already know what I need to change. I'm just going to go for a new one. I'm going to very roughly put it in this particular position. I'm going to zoom out slightly so I can see the entire thing. I'm going to use this position again. I'm just going to put it to X0 so that it snaps to the side of the texture, and then width is going to be maxed. Now, I'm not exactly sure what kind of height and Y coordinate I need to do, so I'm just simply going to I'm just going to make this even smaller so I can see the actual building a bit better, and I'm just going to observe the texture where it's exactly applying. I believe that I need to look at this corner with this particular building if I'm going to do changes to the y coordinate. So as you can see, I need to go a little bit higher with this value. So for example, 158, maybe 65, something like this. And I would just fiddle with these numbers. I would type them in manually like this to fit perfectly that corner. 74 is probably going to be it, right? And that's looking already... Oh, no. Now we have to look at the opposite corner and then change the height of the texture. So that would probably be something like 90 perhaps. I can't exactly see it in here. 84 maybe, 85. 86 looks about right. The texture is tiled on the roof in here. Maybe 87 is actually going to be it. Yeah, there we go. Now I would turn it somewhat opaque so that the original structure is going to be visible a little bit, and then I'm just going to change the color. So let's say that I want to have it blue, for example. I would like to have it a bit more blue, so I'm just going to turn the opacity a little bit like that, and then play around with other colors as well. Now there is also the function for border. This obviously is not exactly useful if you are having the entire texture covered with the color rectangle. The border is not going to be visible, and it's not exactly useful for these kinds of tiled structures, right? But well, let me show you. I'm just going to use the border in here. Well, actually maybe this could be useful. It's just going to create, with this particular case, it's going to create these patterns. As you can see here in the window, it's literally just creating a border with the same opacity as the original color rectangle, and this color window is going to change its color. Now there is one thing to note with this change, and that is related to how the texture is rendered. I'm not exactly sure about the correct terminology in here, but you are probably going to see it right away what I mean. So this building, this one, this highlighted, I'm going to go into the text customization, and I'm just going to click the text field. I'm going to put a text field somewhere. I don't even need to do anything with it, and then I'm going to delete it. All right. So basically I just did a change, but then I deleted the change. And watch the difference between the textures, between the rendering of the textures for the two buildings, right? It's as if this building on the right suddenly lost some, I don't know, some kind of anti-aliasing of all the details on the facade, right? So this is something to keep in mind. If you are going to use the text fields or the color rectangles, this is going to happen. And I suppose this is related to that lower FPS when you are doing those kinds of changes, because it just some kind of unlocks the texture for these kinds of changes, and then it's just going to leave it like this. So some objects are going to be worse than others. Again, with this particular building, it's not really visible, I suppose, because it doesn't really have those details. This particular building has those lines for the bricks, right? So those are going to look bad, especially when you are going to be zooming out. With these kinds of signs, it's really not a big deal. And this building also is looking okay, but yeah, different buildings are just going to react differently to it. If you want to put text or change colors only on certain parts of like a very large structure, like a building, for example, it doesn't really make sense to convert the building into procedural objects to do that, tiny little details. So if I wanted to put a sign on the building or some kind of an ad or something like that, or like a text, if it's a train station, maybe, whatever, then it might be just much better to pick some kind of an object, like much smaller, simpler object, like for example, a sign or a billboard or something like that, and convert that into PO and use it as the sign. So I'm going to take this industrial park highway sign, for example. I would use the color rectangle to put some kind of a base, really. So for example, turn it gray, and then I'm just going to do the text just like this, and then I can just use the size changes and all of that. Obviously you would pick an object that has enough resolution so that the text will be visible, and you can put the text with the necessary size on it, of course. So if I, for example, wanted this sign to be longer, then I could stretch it like that, and then I would go into the text customization and play around with the X X scaling. As you can see, that's exactly what I was talking about, right? And then I would just position it on the building, simple as that. And I don't need to convert the entire building into procedural object. The same applies to recoloring. So for example, the roof. If I wanted to put some kind of a different thing on the roof, I would just go for the ploppable asphalt. And I would take all these ploppable asphalt squares and I would just put them on the roof. And with procedural objects, I can just recolor this as I want. If it's too dark, I'm just going to make it a bit brighter. And what's really good about this particular technique is that these procedural object surfaces, ploppable surfaces, they do show decals. So I could, for example, put some kind of stain decals on the roof and, you know, detail it and make it different. So if you, for example, want to do some different variations of the roof or something like that, obviously you can only recolor certain parts, so maybe just below these ACs and whatnot, or on the outside, or put grass on top of it and whatnot. So you don't need to convert the building to PO to change those like tiny portions of the buildings, or even larger ones, as you can see over here. The color rectangle can also be used to change the colors of all these holographic ads and signs. So for example, this one is yellow. As you can see, I cannot really change the color using this at all. And by the way, this applies for any kind of object that doesn't have a color map, so you cannot even use this coloring tool. So you would have to go into the text customization, simply apply a color rectangle just like before, put it in the corner, max the width and height. You don't even need to turn the opacity lower because there is no structure for this particular sign. And you would just change its color and it's completely going to change the color to whatever you need. And it's going to retain that glowing aspect of it. So it's going to be looking really good during the night still. And it's also going to retain that transparency, as you can see. Then we have the render distance and export functions. That's exactly like before. We already talked about it. But then we have the animation modules. So let's talk about every one of these modules and start with the self-rotation one. So this is very simple. It's just going to make the object rotate along the axes that are starting from the origin point of that building. That is the plus icon position, right? So you're just going to open the window. The window is very simple. You have the enable on and off button. That's just going to make the animation stop and toggle it back on. It only works when the game is unpaused. Then we have the delete button. That's just going to delete the module, and speed. So I'm just going to unpause the simulation. And as you can see, the building is now rotating because by default, the y-axis is selected as rotation. As you can see in here, the rotation value is changing. So be careful about that because this is just changing in real time the orientation and you cannot revert it. So if I was to delete the module, the orientation is going to remain and I cannot Control Z it to put it back into its position, all right? So that's something to really keep in mind. I would have to just manually reset the orientation completely, as you can see. So it might be a good idea to, for example, keep a copy of that object before you are going to apply any kind of animations to it. So you can revert the positions and orientations later, okay? So then we have the speed, so you can just change that to any kind of value. As you can see, you can really go crazy with this. You can reverse the direction and you can also use the world rotation instead of local. That's basically the change between global and local coordinates, just like we talked about it with the Gizmo. Now, you can apply the same module twice or 3 times, doesn't matter how many times. So for example, I'm going to click the self-rotation module again. But this time I'm going to set it so that it's going to turn around the x-axis. Right now it's not turning at all because this one is for speed of 10 reverse direction. This one is speed 10 normal direction. So it cancels each other out. But now I'm going to just switch it for x. And as you can see, it's now going to turn along the y and x at the same time. I could also add a third module with z coordinates, for example, or switch it for world rotation and, you know, just have these kinds of crazy combinations. I can just quickly disable one of these or both of these with the enable on and off. So I don't need to delete it right away to stop the animation. The simple rotate around module works similarly, although you can change the center of the rotation. It doesn't need to be the origin point of the building. It might be a little bit confusing how you set that up, so let's talk about it. And also, it's only available in the Y direction. I'm going to set the speed for example, 10 or something. By default, this module is not going to apply the rotation right away. You need to set the center first, and you're going to do it like this. So I'm going to pause the game just to show you how it works. I want to have this point as the center of the rotation. So I'm just going to set center, click the set center. Nothing is going to happen, it's just going to be set in the background. Now I'm going to use the gizmo and I'm going to move the building, for example, 10 meters or 15 meters in this direction, all right? So I'm just going to use the gizmo, type in the value just like we did before. Now I'm going to unpause the game and look at that. The center of the rotation is going to be that original point, and now the building is just turning with the 15-meter radius like I said it. And I can also click the reverse direction and it's just going to move back. And again, if I'm going to delete this, then I am going to be able to put it back to that original position because that's a reversible action because I technically used the gizmo for that. But rotation, I will have to, switch manually back. Then we have the gravity module, and this one is starting to be a little bit complicated. So let's explain how you can use it. You have the same enable delete buttons just like before. Then you have the state buttons. You can either switch it to repeat on and off. I'm going to explain it later. And then the start button, because by default, this module is not going to do anything until you start it, actually, all right? Then you have the time speed. That's just going to make the entire motion faster or slower. By default, it's 1 times. Now, then you have the G, that is basically the gravity constant that it's going to calculate with. And then you have the initial speed in meters per second in these 3 directions. All right, so that's going to be important. Let's, for example, first look at the Y motion. So let's just set it for, 10 in the Y coordinate. You cannot put negative numbers in here, all right? They have to be positive. So I'm just going to click start and look what's going to happen. It's going to be just a simple bouncing because I only set it in the vertical motion, the initial speed. Now, I have it set for repeating on. Now, in this particular case, you're not really going to notice if I switch it off because I'm also bouncing it times -1, which means infinity times, all right? If I was to switch it to 0, then it's going to keep bouncing because I have that repeat on. But if I switch repeat off, then it's just going to bounce a single time and then it's going to return back, but only after I actually restart it. So now I'm going to click back, it's going to revert into its original state, and now it's going to take into consideration the new changes to this bounce time 0. All right, so as you can see, it only bounced a single time, and then it just, after it finished its motion, it returned. So if I'm going to do it again, start, then as you can see, this button is now back. Once it finishes the movement, I did not click it, it's immediately going to switch back to start. So it finished the movement and it basically reset. Now, watch what happens if I'm going to, for example, introduce also the Z movement. So it's not going to go just up, but it's also going to go into this direction. And now I have the repeat off and also bounce 0. So it's just going to do that one motion and it's going to stay in this position. And this also cannot be reverted, all right? So I would have to manually use the gizmo to put it back. So that's something to remember. If I switched it for repeat on, then it's going to bounce into that new position and then it's immediately going to teleport to the start of the motion. If I'm going to click back button, it's going to revert to the starting point, all right? If I'm going to now here switch the bounce to something like 1, then it's going to do 2 of those motions. It's basically the number of repetitions in here. And of course, the bouncing times are going to apply for that another movement after the previous one was finished. So now the motion already started. I'm going to change this to infinity, for example, or 10, doesn't matter. But it's not going to be applied in this cycle. It's going to be applied in the next one, right? So now it bounced one times, now it's going to bounce another time, and it's just going to do 10 or 8 additional bounces in this particular case. All right, so I would have to put it back and then do some kind of changes. Now the factor button is going to basically multiply the values after the initial motion. So you are going to do the initial bounce with these values, so 10y, 10z, and then all these additional bounces with the the number of times that you have here are going to have the factor applied to them. All right, it might be a little bit confusing, I suppose. So if I, for example, type 2 and start it, it's going to do the normal bounce at first, and the second bounce is going to be times 2. You can see that it bounced much higher and much further away. All right, so this can be useful for some kind of like multiplications of the bounces or something like that. Okay, so then we can change the time speed. As you can see, it's going to be much faster. This is not changed by the speed of the game, of the simulation. All right, so as you can see by the grass sprites, I increased the simulation speed to the 3 times motion basically, but the animation is not going to be faster. Okay, so animation is just going to be the same no matter the game speed or simulation speed. It is going to be affected by the game speed. I said it wrong. If you are going to use the play it mod and you are going to increase, then as you can see, it is going to also increase the speed of the animation. All right, and then we have the children on group follow motion. This is very important and very useful for some complicated animations. So let's, for example, create a couple of different of these objects over here, and we are going to put them in a group. I'm going to make a group. Now, it was actually kind of important that that object is going to be the first one, so I'm going to have the menu right there, make group. Now I'm going to enter the group into this object and into the module again, all right? By the way, when you are going back into the modules, it's really important that you're going to click the module in the current modules list, because in here I would just add another one, yeah? So make sure that you are going to click this one on the top. Now I'm going to click the children in group follow motion. Actually, I'm not going to click it just to show you what this does. So now it's going to be just this object doing the motion. But if I'm going to click this, then it's going to be all of those in the group doing the same motion. All right, so that's very, very handy. Then we have the back and forth to module, and this animation is responsible for just moving the object between points A and B, so just between 2 points. It might be a little bit confusing, all of these settings, so let's just go over them. You're going to first have it like this when you first create the module, and you will have these 2 unset buttons. You're going to click both of them, so you're going to prepare them for setting the points. Let's just say that this position of the object is okay for me, so that's going to be point A. I'm going to click set A, okay? Then I'm just going to use the gizmo and move it to that second point, so for example over here. And then I will click set B. All right, and now I can just click the start button and it's going to do the animation. It's going to just move the object from point A to B, and then it's going to reset the cycle so that it's going to repeat like that. Now, I'm going to go back. I'm going to click the back button and it's going to just move it back to A, the original position. So you don't need to worry about, in this particular module, you don't need to worry about storing the original position, because you can just revert it to it. And also, unless you start the animation, it's not going to start on its own, even though the game is unpaused. Okay, so let's now go over each and every one of these windows and explain what they do, what kind of values you can put into them. So let's start from the top. We have this one delay, and this is basically the delay at the start of the entire animation, okay? So after you press the start button. So I'm going to put some kind of a value in here, for example, 2. Now I'm going to click the start button. Nothing is going to happen because it's waiting for that delay. And after 2 units of time pass, it's going to start doing the animation, and then it's just going to repeat the animation cycles without any additional delay. All right. So I'm just going to click back. I'm going to put this back to 0 because I don't need it really. Now the end delay, that is the delay after every single end of the animation cycle, all right? So I'm just going to put it to 1 so it's a little bit faster, and then I'm going to click start. When I click start, it's immediately going to do something because delay is 0, one delay is 0. But at the end of the motion, at the end of the cycle, it's going to do that delay 1, as you can see over here. Okay, so those are the delay buttons or delay windows up here. Then we need to explain all of these windows kind of together because they are just working together. So in this gray area, you basically have times it takes the object to reach from A to B. Then you have, in this last window, the B to A. And by default, it's 0. That's why when I'm going to click the start button, it's simply going to do the first motion, then it's going to do the end delay, and then it's just going to reset, teleport back, okay? So if I want to have some kind of a motion from B to A, I'm just going to have to put some kind of non-zero number in this fourth window. And then also, I need to have an even number in the times for the motion. Because as you can see in this bracket, we have the A to B plus B to A times. So if it's 1, it's only going to be the A to B motion. And then it's going to reset the motion, teleport back to A from B, okay? It's not going to take into consideration any kind of value that we put here. So we have to put at least 2 over here. And watch what's going to happen. I'm going to start it. It's going to move from A to B. It's going to move from B to A. There it's going to wait because it's the end of the motion, end of the cycle. That is set by the N delay. And then it's just going to continue, then it's going to reset. But we are not going to see the teleportation anymore because we have finished the cycle at the same point where we started, okay? So now, we can also do some additional things. So for example, I can also put a number into this B position. By the way, if you are going to click these little A and B buttons, then it's going to just show you those positions in there. Okay, so I can, for example, make it wait at B. Those are going to be the first and third windows over here. The first is for waiting at A, and the third is for waiting at B. So now if I'm going to start it, it's going to start the motion like this, wait for one time unit at B, move back to A, then there is going to be the end delay, and then it's going to reset. So in a way, right now, I don't need to put any kind of value for waiting at A, because that's taken care of by the N delay, all right? But if I, for example, put this motion to 4 times, then it's going to start the animation, so A to B, waiting at B, B to A, then it's going to not wait at A, immediately going to go A to B, wait at B, B to A again, and those were 4 motions, so now we are at the end, and the end delay is going to apply, okay? So that's exactly how this works. So if you want to have some sort of a regular motion between the A, B, and basically have like seamless transitions between the cycles, you should have the times set to 2. That's probably the best. You don't need to have any kind of value in the waiting for A, because that's basically taken care of with the N delay value. And then you're going to have the same value for waiting at B. All right, that's basically it. So this kind of animation is useful for just maybe for some kind of like shunter locomotives at some kind of a train yard, if you just want to move them around the entire area, or maybe some kind of cranes in like an industrial area. You won't just want to have them, go around the place like this. Now, you can also change the speed curves, and this basically means that they are going to be smoothened from the starting points. So if I'm going to switch it for the second button, it's going to mean that it's going to accelerate slowly first, and then it's going to decelerate, all right? This third button is just the acceleration smoothened, and this fourth button, it's simply the deceleration smoothened, all right? So it's probably best that you're going to go for the second one, but also keep in mind that it's not going to change the time it takes to reach that second point. So obviously the acceleration and deceleration means that it's going to take more time. So it's going to reach higher speed in the middle between those points. So you would probably want to then raise the time it takes to reach those second points by some reasonable number, obviously, so that it looks good. And just like before, this is not affected by the actual simulation speed, but it is affected by the game speed. So for example, in Play It, if I switch the game speed to something higher, then it is going to switch that animation as well. And just like before, we have the children in group follow the motion. Okay, so if I'm going to reset this to back, click the button down here, start it, then all three of these objects are going to move together. So this is again useful if that shunter locomotive that you would have has some kind of trailers or some kind of details. And of course, all of these modules can be combined. So I can, for example, click the self-rotation module, and I can also have the object rotate along the y-axis as it is moving around. So again, this is useful for all kinds of details around your city. An example of this combination could have been seen in that Altengrad war video where I used this scene, and what I did is I used for the turret the self-rotation modules, two of them along two axes, and of course the gravity module with the initial speed going up and slightly forward to follow the speed of the vehicle when it was struck. And also there's the effects module for the bottom, for the chassis, which is going to have that shooting flame up. And the last one is the effects module. Now this one is a little bit different because it's not going to change the position or rotation of the building of this particular object, but it's just going to add some sort of animation effect to it. You have all of these effects written over here. These are all the effects that you are already familiar with from the vanilla game. So it's all kinds of dusts, or the rocket launch particles, for example, all kinds of steam, for example, the placement dust when you place down objects, and all these different things. Now, it's not exactly all that good to apply it to some kind of a large object like this. In my opinion, it's probably best to just apply it to like a single vertex. So if I'm just going to merge all these vertices, just turn the building into just this single point, then that's going to be my point of origin for that animations effects, all right? So for example, if I'm going to now click the fire particles, it's going to do the fire effect. Now, different effects react differently to these kinds of settings. So, for example, width, I can just make it wider, of course. I can make it reach higher, and magnitude is basically going to make it, look like more intensive in this particular case. There is the acceleration. I'm not really sure what that does. That's in this particular case for the fire, it's just going to make it reach like higher or something. I'm not exactly sure what that's doing. Directions, that's the direction it's going to follow. So right now it's in this particular direction. I can also turn it so that it's going to appear as it's exiting some kind of a like a side of a building, a window, or something like that. Fire is obviously going to go up at the end anyway, but it's going to start like shooting that fire in like a horizontal direction. It's if you are going to switch these direction axes. Offset, that's basically just the offset from the origin point, and emit, that's going to make it emit the particles at these intervals, right? So you can just switch it to emit it every 10 seconds, for example. Right now I have the game game speed. Game speed is going to affect this. So right now I have it at 0.5, so it's going to be 20 seconds in real time, of course. Or you can just set it to emit every frame, and it's going to be very intensive like that. So there are all these kinds of different particles. I'm not really sure if it's still a problem, but I had a problem with the effects module, and that was after I reloaded the save file. Basically, if I click the effects module again, this window would be empty. I'm not really sure if it was fixed or not. If it wasn't, then that's just a bug in procedural objects. And let's now finally talk about the mode that is going to allow us to manipulate the vertices of models, which is probably the main point of procedural objects anyway. So in the general tool, we are going to click customization, and we are now in the customization tool. And as you can see, we have all the vertices now visible. So we have the controls tooltip in the customization window. As you can see, I really recommend that you familiarize yourself with these. I'm going to be talking about some anyway. And then we have various options. But first, let's start by selecting the vertices. So we can select vertices just like the whole procedural object. So left-clicking the vertices is going to select them. It's going to turn them red, as you can see. And if I'm going to hold Control, then I can just keep clicking more, and it's going to add to the selection. And as you can see, some of these functions are now highlighted because they are available only for selections. So right-clicking and dragging also selects multiple vertices, as you can see. And again, I can hold Control and just keep adding to this selection, either one by one or just like with the selection before. And when I right-click somewhere else, it's going to clear that selection. When you have an object that has tens of thousands of vertices, as you can see by just moving the camera, it is already slowing down the game by just having the customization tool opened, and it's going to slow down even more when I try selecting the vertices. So this is actually like a little tip. So when you select some kind of group of vertices like that, and you want to add to that selection, you would hold Control and then right click and drag. But don't do that, because let me actually demonstrate. If I'm just going to right click and drag, as you can see, yeah, it's not exactly fast, but it's manageable. But when I'm going to hold Control, it's going to completely freeze, and there's going to be like every 10 seconds a frame or something. So completely useless, right? I cannot work like that. So I'm gonna let go of Control on the keyboard. It's gonna take a couple of seconds to refresh or remember that the game is supposed to be running normally. Yeah, there we go. And what you can do to add this selection still, you can simply right click and drag to your selection like this. And just when you are about to let go of the mouse button, I'm gonna hit Control, let go of the mouse button, let go of Control. All right. So don't hold Control when you are dragging that selector tool. So again, right click, drag, quickly hold Control, let go of the mouse button, let go of Control. All right. So if you have these kinds of huge objects and you want to select like that, use this. Another thing to remember is that when you are selecting vertices, they are also going to be selected behind the camera. So for example, you might think that it might be a good idea to zoom in to some kind of a detail, like for example these windows down here. Let's just say that I want to select these and I don't know, just move them around a little bit, but look at that. Oh no, I also selected the roof because I was zoomed in and the roof was behind the camera. And if I, had some kind of carefully prepared shapes up here, I would totally ruin it. So be careful about that and only select vertices from the outside of the object. This is especially a problem if you have some kind of like L-shaped buildings or circular buildings and something. Always work from the outside. And also sometimes you might simply encounter when you are just working on some really complicated object, then the game is going to start lagging a little bit too much. Then you can simply just exit procedural objects. As you can see, FPS immediately returns back, and then just go back in and it should be a little bit better. So let's now go over the basics of manipulating the vertices, that is changing their position, rotation, and scale. So you have these three options in here. By default, position is going to be enabled. You can just click between them and change either one of these. So let's start with position. I'm going to select these vertices, for example, and if I want to move them, if I want to change their position, then I'm just simply going to left click and drag. And by default, you are going to see these two axes, always two axes, depending on your camera position. So when I have this very low angle shot, the camera position looking into the distance, then I'm always going to be changing the vertical coordinate and one of the horizontal coordinates. All right, if I don't like the position that I just did, then I'm just going to hit Control Z. If I'm going to move the camera like this, then that horizontal direction is going to change into that red axis, as you can see. And from the top view, I'm just going to have both of the horizontal axes right there. Now, by default, it's going to snap to these axes, which is kind of handy. But if you don't want that, you are either going to just move the mouse cursor away from the axes, or you're going to hold Control, and then you can just move it freely without snapping to anything. And as you can see, the axes are going to appear at the point where you are first going to left click. So let's, for example, say that I would like to move these vertices down here so that these like white outlines of the floors are going to align. So I would not click and drag over here because I would not see the corner, but I would probably click somewhere off the object so that the axis is going to be on the side right there. Now let's just say that I would like to do that change, and I'm not really going to do it just right, as you can see. So what I would do in this case, I would either just Control Z it back, but let's just say that I can't or don't want to or something, then I would just put it slightly back, because if I wanted to do some changes right now, as you can see, it's going to be keep snapping between the two different axes, right? It's not going to be all that fine. So I would just put it a little bit back and then drag it again to its position, and now I would take care to do it right. There we go. You can also use the arrow keys and page up and down, or depending on how you set it up, it's all going to be written here in the controls tooltip. So the arrows are just going to control the horizontal positions. Page up and down is of course going to change the vertical positions. And by the way, these are going to be the same even when you rotate the object, so the entire object. So these are in the local coordinates. So for example, if I'm going to put the object like this, and then I'm going to select the roof, then moving it like this, left and right, you're still going to be using page up and down, all right? Because these are in the local coordinates, like I said. Now, these can be Control Z back, but only like one click of that arrow keys, for example, is going to be reverted, not the entire motion, like with move it, for example. So you are going to be clicking Control Z a couple of times if you are going to revert to that original position, as you can see. There we go. Now, by default, when you click once the position keys, it's going to move the vertices by a certain amount. And if you want to lower that step, you are going to hold Alt. As you can see, it's now going to use much finer steps. And if you don't want to use steps at all and you would just like to have it smooth, then you are just going to hold Shift. And if you want this movement to be slower, then together with it, you're going to hold Alt again, all right? So as you can see, now these are very, very slow. Then we have the rotation. So again, I have this selection of vertices. If I have the camera positioned in this direction, then it's always going to rotate in the axes, like going from the camera, into the distance. So in this case, it's going to be this red axis, as you can see. And again, it's in the local coordinates. So if I move the camera a little bit to the corner of the building, then it's still going to be in that local coordinates, all right? So if I'm just now going to be moving the camera around while holding the left mouse button, you can clearly see where that axis is aiming. Now, this can be also reverted. In this direction, it's going to be the different axis, and from the top, it's going to be the vertical axis, as you can see. The pivot point of that rotation is always going to be in like a geometrical center of some kind of a bounding box of this entire selection. It's not going to take into consideration, for example, the number of vertices or something like that. So let's just say that I want to only rotate like front of the building, for example, then I would only select these. And as you can see, now the pivot point, the axis, is actually going to be at the front of the building. It's not going to go from the origin point of the object, for example. It's always going to take consideration the selection, okay? So, for example, if I wanted to select only these vertices and maybe just one vertex on this side, it's going to be in the middle between all of these, all right? And then we have a scaling tool, which is going to just scale this entire selection in all three axes all at once. And you cannot change it. You cannot, for example, scale in only a single axis. So if I have like a bigger 3D selection, more 3D, not exactly flat, then as you can see, it is going to be scaling it when I left click and drag. It's going to be scaling it in all three axes. Of course, if I would select some kind of vertices that have that are in a plane, then it's clearly going to only scale them in that plane. So for example, this front facade of the building, I could just shrink it, or I could make it larger, and it's clearly going to keep being in that plane. And for both of the rotation and scaling options, you can also use the arrow keys and page up and down to change position. So I can, for example, have this selection like that selected. I'm just going to be rotating it around, and together with it, you have to let go of the left mouse button, and then I can just use the arrow keys to move it around. So if you are trying to do some kind of, position and rotation changes all at once, you're going to use the keyboard for position and mouse for rotation. Knowing how to select the vertices and change their positions, rotations, and scale is, of course, the main point of procedural objects. So when you know that, you are pretty much set. You can just do like 90% of the usual detailing changes in city skylines using procedural objects. So let's now go over certain tips or little techniques with selection of vertices and doing some kind of basic changes. So first of all, if you are trying to work on some small area, for example this railing over here, as you can see, using just the WASD keys on my keyboard is not really all that good for getting the camera just right, so I can really see that little corner. So what I do is I'm just going to use Play It mode, and I'm going to decrease the game speed. I usually use 20%, you might go even lower, and then the WASD keys are going to be so much finer. The zoom mouse wheel is not really going to be affected too much, but these keys will. And as you can see, I can really go into these details. The next thing that can be a big problem is selecting the right vertices that belong to the faces that you are trying to change. So let's just say that I would like to increase the height of this column, of this railing, and not touch anything else. But this little area over here is a little bit detailed, and there are a bunch of vertices that I'm not exactly sure what they belong to. So I'm usually using this technique where I'm just going to go over each and every one of these vertices, and I'm just going to move them somewhere else using the arrows, or in this particular case page up and down, because I'm going to move them in this empty area above. So let's just say that I would like to only get those 4 vertices that are forming the top face of this column, all right? So I would just select, for example, this one. That's probably the corner. Yeah, that seems to be right. So I'm just going to move it. So I would just press once, page up. And now that I see that it is the vertex that I want, I'm going to press it one more time to put it one click higher. Then let's just say that maybe this one is the second point. Yep, seems about right. So let's put it into that second level, just like before. This corner probably seems to be the opposite corner. Yep, that's it. So let's put it on that second level as well. And now it gets tricky. So let's, for example, say this vertex maybe. No, that seems to be the railing. So I'm just going to keep it in that first level. This vertex down here, nope, that's the second railing. This vertex perhaps, yeah, that seems to be it. That probably seems to be the railings column. Yeah, so I have all of those that I wanted to get. Now I'm just going to select these. And I'm just going to click page down once, and it's going to move them exactly into their initial position. And I have these 4, and I can just do whatever I want with them. Let's just say that with this particular building, I would like to get rid of the roof. So I would want to maybe cut it. There seems to be this like a line in here with all these windows, right? So I would like to select everything above this this top line of these windows. So I could go one by one and selecting those, but a much better way is to simply position the camera so that you are going to be at the cut. So especially with these kinds of complicated buildings, it's going to be a little tricky, but yeah, as you can see now I have this like a line through the vertices. So I would just go into one side of the building, and I would make this like a cut through it. There we go. Now I have that. Now to select the rest of the building, I would just move a little bit outside and select it like this. And then I can, for example, merge it or, do whatever I want with it. One very important thing to remember is that when you are right-clicking and dragging to select vertices, you need to actually select that physical vertex on the building. So when you have these blue markers symbolizing the positions of the vertices, you actually need to select that point beneath them where the vertex of that model is. So for example, this one on the corner right here. If I just barely touch it with the marquee selector, then it's not going to be selected, all right? Not from this direction either. So I actually I don't need to completely cover it in that marquee selector, but I actually need to cover the corner of the building. This is really important when you are trying to, for example, select some kind of very tight areas where you are not going to be very sure what you are even selecting. So let's just, for example, say that I want to select only the vertices that are on the front of the building, yeah? So again, I would position the camera perfectly so that it matches the plane of the front of the building. And now I don't really need to worry. about over-selecting anything else, because it doesn't matter that I'm going to be just simply like touching lightly some of these other blue vertices or even going into that little check mark, because it doesn't matter. I actually need to select the point of the model. So as you can see, now I actually did select only the vertices on the front face. And if I, for example, wanted to work with these later, I can simply just press once some arrow key, or like 5 times, or it needs to be some kind of a number that you will remember, all right? And it needs to be like far enough so that it's not going to interfere with your next selection process. So let's just, for example, say that I did this, then I would like to do some changes to the building's facade, whatever, and after I'm done, I would just put it back. So I did it 2 times here, so 1, 2, there we go. So this is kind of useful when you are trying to just change some details on a facade or something. You would simply just use like a larger area. You would kind of move it to like a workspace outside using some kind of set number of clicks with the arrow buttons. And then when you are done, you're just going to select everything and put it back. And you can also type in the numbers, just like we did when changing the positions, rotations, or scale of the entire procedural object. So let's, for example, say that I would like to change the position of this roof, and I would just left click and drag up, and I'm just going to type in, for example, 5 meters. And as you can see, the window 5 is going to appear there. If I'm now going to move the mouse cursor, it's going to clear that selection. So again, for example, 10, I would type in, and if I wanted to move it lower, I would type -10, just like before. This works with rotation, so rotation 90 degrees, for example. And of course, it also works with scaling. So if I wanted to just scale this by 0.5, I can easily do that. Now, if I want to scale something, but I only want to do it in certain axes, then I can actually do it. So for example, I have this white stripe on the wall, and if I just select all of it and scale it down, then it's also going to squash it. It's going to make it shorter. And I don't want that. Let's just say that I want to keep that vertical size. So I would need to do it plane by plane. So I would need to select all the vertices in a single plane, so for example this one, and I would scale it down. And I'm going to use the numbers in here because I want to do it exactly the same for the lower plane. So let's just say 0.2, for example, all right? And then I would select that second plane and also scale it down by 0.2. And now I scaled it, but I kept the vertical size. And of course, if I wanted to scale only in a single axis, then I would have to do it in a line. I must not select vertices that are in a plane, but they must be in a line. So let's, for example, say that I would like to squash this extruded part of the building and or like shrink its width in this direction. So I would just select like a line like that from the side, of course, and then I would scale it down again, maybe 0.2. Then I would need to go into this view again, select the bottom line and scale that 0.2, just like before. Sometimes when selecting vertices, it might actually be faster if you just select like a line like this. And let's just say that I don't want to have all the vertices selected, but you can go in and just holding Control and left click the ones you don't want away. So this might be a little bit faster if, for example, there is like a big line and you only want to keep like a single window intact or something like that. So now let's go over all the action buttons. As you can see, by default, only the recenter object origin is active. It does exactly the same thing as before. It's just going to put the origin point at that lowest vertex. Now, all of these other functions only work when you have something selected. And by the way, only the split each selected vertex is active when you select just a one. The rest of them are going to be enabled when you have some kind of multiple selection active. Alright, so the invert selection is pretty straightforward. If you have a selection, you're just going to click it and it's going to invert it. The split each selected vertex is a really powerful function that's going to allow us to cut these models. So what I mean by that, when you have a vertex, just this single vertex on the corner, by default, it's defining multiple faces on the model. So when I'm going to move it, then as you can see, I'm moving multiple faces, the side brick wall, the front little column, and that white outline, right, on both walls here. So I would like to have a single vertex for each one of these faces. So that's exactly what that split each selected vertex button does. I'm going to click it, and you might see that this vertex is now a little bit brighter. That's because I have 4 vertices now in one position, and I need to extract them. I need to only get the ones that I want. So for example, this big brick wall. So I'm going to use the same extract function or technique as before. So I'm just going to left click once. So I'm selecting a single vertex somewhere down below it, and I'm just going to press this in this direction, the arrow button. So this is not exactly the vertex that I want. Let's click another time. No, this is not the one either. This one, yes, this is the one. So I'm going to move it in that second layer and return these back. So now we created a hole in the building because we disconnected the faces. So I would do this, for example, for all 4 of these corners. And I would have, I'm not going to do that because it would be too long, but, or I might, for example, if I'm okay with that, just do this kind of a, change. So just move that one corner, put it basically in that other corner to just, make those faces really, really small. And maybe I would be okay with that particular change. If I, for example, wanted to make like a hole in the building for some kind of like a connecting bridge from a neighboring building, or I wanted to put more windows in here that are kind of inside the building, or various changes. So I might, for example, do something with the windows. If I wanted to cut the windows, I would do exactly the same thing. So here this window is connected to that wall. So I'm just going to click split each vertex, select the point, and look at that. Now the window is disconnected and I can just do whatever I want with it. For example, get rid of it and again create a hole in the building. So I'm usually using this to create various openings for like garage entrances or these kinds of like tunnels, connecting tunnels between buildings, or if I want to decorate the interior or, things like that. So every time you need to see inside the model. And by the way, the split each vertex function cannot be reverted. Once you click it, it is going to create those additional vertices and you cannot Control Z it back. Then we have the merge vertices function, and this one I'm using all the time because it allows you to just get rid of certain parts of the building and only extract some features of it. So let's just say that I don't really care about this top floor. So I'm just going to select all of it like that and hit merge vertices. And it's just going to put it all into a single point. It's not going to actually merge the vertices into a single vertex. No, the vertices are still there, all of them, but they now share the same coordinates. So it's important to now not click this node or this vertex with just left clicking because you would select only one of them, but you actually now just need to select it with that right click mouse dragging. It's always going to create the new position for the vertices again in that like a center of the bounding box of your selection. So for example, if I'm going to select a whole bunch of vertices in here and then just a single vertex over here, it is still gonna be in the middle between them. All right, so that's actually something to remember, and it's actually something that you can use to your advantage. Let's just put this beautiful creation back. You can revert it with Control Z. So let's just say that I would like to close maybe this bottom window. So I would like to select these vertices on the top, hit merge vertices, and like a curtain, it's going to nicely close it down. As you can see, I can also do it for the foundations, for example. Now, if I wanted only the front face of the building together with the windows, so I would like to keep these. So I could actually just select all of that, what I want to keep, and then click invert, selection, merge vertices, and there we go. Now I only have the front of the building that I wanted. You might be a bit careful with this because as you can see, some models that you are going to extract these facades from, for example, they are going to be made so that you are then going to have these like faces going through that 3D facade. So you might actually want to merge only partially these kinds of facades or buildings at the back and create like multiples of these merged nodes, right? So then you are not going to have these like artifacts, and you can just use this facade. I usually do this kind of thing when I'm creating like some shop windows, when I just want to copy paste them, something like that. The align vertices function does exactly that. It's going to put vertices in a line, and it's going to automatically decide what kind of line based on the longest distance between or inside that selection. So for example, maybe I'm going to have these vertices on the side of the building like super randomly. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe it's like a remnant of some detailing, and I would just like to align them to a single line. So I would just select all of these on the side, and I'm going to hit align vertices. There we go. So in this particular situation, it automatically decided that the first and last vertices were these because they are the furthest apart in that selection. And of course, it's going to also work diagonally. So if this first vertex was all the way up here and I would select all of these, then it would align it diagonally like this. But as you can see, it did not keep the, for example, the vertical distance or the vertical coordinate of these vertices. Why? Well, because it moved it. If you imagine that virtual connecting point from that first to last, then it's always going to move the vertices perpendicularly to that line. It's not going to move them like this on the horizontal axis. It's always going to move them perpendicularly closest to that virtual line. So it's something to really keep in mind that that's how it works. Then we have flatten selection action, and this one works kind of similarly to align vertices, although it's going to put the vertices to a plane, not a line, and it's always going to be a horizontal plane defined by the selection. The plane is always going to be in the middle of this selection, and it's only going to move the vertices vertically towards this plane. So for example, when I have this like a roof area, I'm just going to hit flatten selection, and it's going to put it to a single plane. And for example, if I'm going to select these, then it's going to make that selection go to the middle between the highest and lowest point. So if I'm going to click it, then as you can see, it's going to do that. So the flatten selection is mostly useful if you have some kind of, let's say, like a weird edge of a roof maybe that you detailed, or it's just, again, like a remnant of some kind of extraction from like a bigger model or something, and you would really like to put it to a single plane. So instead of fiddling with align vertices, you're just going to use flatten selection and do it quickly like that. And again, the flatten selection works only with the local coordinates. So you might think that you might be able to use it to, for example, flatten the facade like this. So you're just going to turn it 90 degrees, but no, that's not going to do anything. If I'm going to select it like this, hit flatten, it's actually going to flatten it into that local coordinate. Then we have the snap selection to ground and snap each to ground. So snap selection to ground is going to move the entire selection. It's not going to change the positions of the vertices relative to each other, but it's just going to make it go towards the ground so that the lowest vertex touches the ground. So let's, for example, put one of these vertices like much lower than the rest, and then select all of these. Click snap selection to ground, and there we go. This single little tiny vertex is now the lowest, so that touches the ground, and the rest are exactly the same. If I wanted all of them to snap to ground, then I'm going to use the function snap each to ground. I'm going to click it, and it's just going to squash the selection, just like the projection function, for example. When you are trying to work on some building and you would like to move the bottom vertices, maybe even lower, you're going to notice that the texture is gone. And below the 0 point, the origin point of the building, you don't really see anything because there is only that foundation texture. So how to get rid of this? Well, instead of moving the entire object up and down, that's not really going to do anything, as you can see in here, then you are simply going to go into that customization tool. You're going to select every single vertex of the building, and now you're going to use arrows to move the building higher. So I would use the page up and down, and I'm going to count how many times I did it. So I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then I would go back to the general tool, and here I would position it lower by half of that, because changes to the entire building are basically doubled. All right, so now I'm going to only use 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to be exactly in the same position, but now the origin point is much lower, as you can see, and I can easily change the position of the bottom vertices. Then we have the Conform Selection to Terrain button, and this is basically just going to snap the selection of vertices to the terrain. So if I'm going to click it, as you can see, it is going to keep that vertical alignment between the vertices. I'm just going to move it a little bit higher so you can see that it actually kept it, but it's going to conform it to the terrain that I have over here. So this is different compared to the snap each to ground, because snap each to ground is going to flatten that selection. As you can see, now I don't have that foundation block, for example, over there. So you're going to see it a bit better if I, for example, select these two floors, gonna conform selection to terrain, it is going to keep those vertical distances between them. And the last button is going to work also for networks and buildings. And of course, if there is no network or building below this selection, then it's just going to snap to terrain. So that's why these buttons are separated, so that you can use the first to actually snap it to the terrain below the network, or you can use the snapping to networks. And then we have the buttons that we already saw. Here you can go back to the general tool, or you can just go back to that initial menu. Now let's talk about the Advanced Edition tools. It's available in both the general tool and the customization tool window, as you can see. And if you're going to click it, it's just going to open a new window with some new functions. So let's go over them, starting from the top. So there we have the show always. If you're going to click that, then it's going to change to daytime only. Click again, nighttime only. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's just going to make the procedural object appear only during certain parts of the day. So this is especially useful for some kind of ads, like holo ads that only display during the night, certain light effects or things like that. I'm using that in Asturias all the time. Then we have the flip faces button, and this is just going to flip the normals on the entire model so that textures are going to be displayed on the other sides of all the faces. So as you can see, with this particular example, it's not like particularly useful, but there are cases where it's really handy. So let's just say that I have this Tokyo Olympic Stadium, and I would like to maybe detail inside of it, do some kind of interior maybe, but have the roof still visible. But the roof is not visible from the bottom. But I want to have it visible also from the top as well, so both faces. So what I would do is I would go into Move It, I would enable Procedural Objects, select the roof, I would hit Alt and Copy button so that I'm going to copy it in place. And now I'm going to have two of those objects right there. I would click it, doesn't really matter which one. I'm going to go into the Advanced Edition tools and flip faces on one of them. And look at that. Now I have one of them on the top, one of them on the bottom, but I can see the texture from both sides. Now, unfortunately, the way City Skylines works, it's not going to display the shadow effect. So one of them, the bottom one, would need to be moved a little bit lower so that shadows are finally going to appear. But that's not really a big deal for a big object like that. Another use might be, for example, for ploppable surfaces. I have this asphalt right here, and if it's, for example, covering some kind of a road or like a train tunnel or something, and I would really like to see the ceiling, then I cannot really do that, right? Because there is no ceiling. So I'm just going to go here. I'm going to make a copy, make it slightly lower, customization, Advanced Edition tools, flip faces, and there we go. Now I have a ceiling. Then we have the cast shadow on. We can just turn shadow casting off. I'm not exactly sure why you would want that, but there is the option. And then there is the reset 3D model. So this is useful if you have, for example, if you made some kind of changes to the procedural object, and maybe you merged some of the vertices, or you just did some kind of stupid changes, and you don't have the changes history, or for example, you reloaded the save file and you cannot really control Z it back, then that's exactly where the Reset 3D button is handy. I'm just going to click it, and it's just going to revert it to its original state. Sometimes you might encounter when you have merged vertices and you reload the save file, for example, or you make a copy of that building, then you're going to go into the Reset 3D model and customization back, and look at that, the vertices are not back. They are still merged together, kind of. So if you're going to click that one vertex up here, it's just going to take those merged vertices just like before. So the only way to go around that these days is to copy paste it, and then it's going to be fine. All right, now the vertices are back. And by the way, you cannot copy paste it through the Gizmo. If you're going to do that, then look at that, it's still there. Then we have the normals recalculation. I'm going to talk about it later because it's kind of related to something else. Right now it's not really going to be all that needed. And then we have the changes history, and this is pretty straightforward. You have the undo, redo buttons. So for example, if I'm going to do some kind of change like merge these vertices, then as you can see here, undo action type moved because it's technically moving those vertices 300 vertices. So yeah, if I'm going to click that button, it's exactly the same as pressing Control Z. Okay, and then we have mirroring and stretching of the model. This slider relates to the stretching. So what does that mean? You have these three buttons, and if you're going to click them, it's going to be stretched in that direction. So for example, if I'm going to put it to ×2 and click the Y button, it's just going to make the building 2 times taller. And then I could go, either I could press Control Z or click this undo button up here, or I can just go to ×0.5, click Y again. So I'm, for example, doing this when I'm trying to change the scaling of the model, but I'm not really sure how much I want to do that. I want to like observe the entire model, and I want to just, click these a couple of times and see how exactly it's going to be switched. And by the way, this is also very useful if you are trying to fiddle with some details. So for example, we were talking about selecting those floors, right? And sometimes it might be not exactly all that easy. So what you can easily do is, for example, stretch the model something like 2 times, if that's going to be enough, click Y, and immediately you are going to have double the distance between all of the vertices, or vertically distance, of course. So it's going to be a lot easier to do any kind of changes. So you can just, fiddle around with it. You can do whatever changes you need to do. And after you're done, you're simply going to stretch it by 0.5 again. Okay, and now for the mirroring, because that's very, very handy for some kind of repeating details or like symmetrical details especially. So I'm just going to make a copy over here, and this is very straightforward. So if I want to have these buildings symmetrical, I would just mirror it to the X direction, because it's always going to be mirrored so that the parallel faces to that axis are going to be like mirrored, right? So this must be the red axis. If I want to flip just the facade, for example, just like this, and maybe put it towards the building. So if I'm going to mirror it to this blue, I'm just going to click the Z axis, and that's going to do exactly what you would expect. So the same thing for the Y axis, and it's always mirroring it to the origin point. So as you can see, it would do this kind of thing. And this can be also reverted with pressing Control Z. Now, a little note about mirroring, but this time with Move It. So I'm going to take Move It. I'm going to select this original, and I'm going to mirror it to this road. So I'm just going to click Mirror Object to this segment. It's going to take a little while, and then it's going to appear there. But is it actually mirrored? No, it's not. Look at that. This big window is right here. But over here I have the small window. So Move It is only mirroring the position and orientation of the procedural objects, but it's not actually going to mirror it like that. So I would need to go here, and I would just need to go into the Advanced Edition tools and mirror it to X again. The Normals Recalculation button is used to fix certain problems with shadows related to the mirrored models. So when you, for example, have some kind of symmetrical detail, like in Asturias, I had those arch bridges that I also made from mirrored pieces. I basically made just 1/4, and I mirrored and copied it everywhere else on the bridge. And all of them had slightly different displaying of shadows. I really cannot replicate it right now, so I cannot show you. But if you're going to get it, you are immediately going to recognize the problem. So if you do have that, then play around with this normal recalculation and try just various methods in here. But what works best is to have the same values, the same method switched for both of those objects, the original and the mirrored copy. And then down here we have the texture tiling. We already talked about it. Alright, so those were all the functions in Procedural Objects, but we are not done just yet, because I would like to show you some specifics related to some different assets. And let's start with Ploppable surfaces from the Ploppable Asphalt Plus mods, or the related assets and the loading time fix mod and all of that. So let's start with the actual Ploppable asphalt. So we have the squares, for example, and there's one little thing to note, and that is you cannot stretch these, actually even the squares or even the circles, you cannot stretch them along the blue axis. Along the red axis, it's perfectly fine, as you can see, but along the blue axis, you can only do it to a certain distance. So watch the mouse cursor, watch the edge of the square, of the rectangle now, and at some point it's actually going to start moving back. So there is like a limit to this stretch, so be aware of that. And even when I have it, for example, here, then you can see that the vertices are already heavily disconnected from the actual displayed model. So it might be a good idea to not really overdo it too much, otherwise you might be a little bit confused where the vertices actually are, what they belong to. So that's just something to remember. So with circles, it's exactly the same. So if I select, for example, these and stretch them in this direction, then look at that. At some point, they are actually going to completely flatten, then invert, and then start moving back. So actually, maybe if you wanted to create like an inverted shape, then you might use this, although the vertices, as you can see, are going to be heavily disconnected just like before. Control Z and put it back. Now with circles, for all the surfaces, all the surface types, you are also going to get a fourth button here, which is called Draw. And this is the function that a lot of people ask me about. Why is it not available for some other assets? And that is because it's only available for ploppable surface circles. Not squares, not any other shapes, the triangles, only the circles. And it works like this. You're going to click it, and then you're going to, it's going to show you that tooltip, left click, start drawing, so do just that. You're going to click, and the object is going to disappear, and now you're going to start putting the vertices where you want them. So I'm just going to left click, place the point, left click here. As you can see, it's showing you the tooltip, so I don't really need to explain it. And it's basically, how this works is that it's putting all the vertices into a single point. You can actually kind of see it that at the mouse cursor, the vertex marker is like brighter. That's because all the vertices are inside of it. Just like if I use the merge function, because that's exactly how this works. So it's only going to be able to use the number of vertices that the circle originally had. So if I'm just going to keep clicking, then at some point it's actually going to automatically stop me. Yeah, there we go. I did not click enter. I did not do anything because I ran out of the original number of vertices, all right? But you don't need to use all the vertices. You can, for example, create just a triangle like that, and it's going to be fine. And do keep in mind that that same limitation also applies to this shape. So if I wanted to stretch this shape like this, then again, it's going to have that thing where there's going to be a limit to stretching it, but in this direction I believe it's going to be absolutely fine. Yeah. So if you want to draw an actual circle, then that's straightforward. You're just going to click in that first position on the outline and you're just going to keep going. And as you can see, the middle point of the circle is automatically created and automatically moved to be between all of these points. So that's very straightforward. This middle point is basically the defining common point for all of the triangles inside of the circle. So as you can see, if I'm moving it around, it's actually defining all the rest of the triangles, right? So this might be a problem when you are trying to create an inverse shape. If you, for example, have some kind of a like an area and you want to have like a hole through the area, circular hole, and you want to fill the surfaces around it, right? So you would need to draw an inverse circle with the surfaces. So you might think that you are just going to start drawing that shape right away, but look at that. It's going to paint that asphalt in the center, and I don't want that. And if I'm going to move this point outside, then it's not really going to work. It's still going to display this shape between the first and the last point. So maybe if I move the last point away, no, that's not really going to work. So the only way to do these inverse shapes is to actually paint like a square and have like one corner cut. Let me show you. So I would start in the corner, I would click one corner, then I would move to that second corner, but there I would do the shape that I wanted to, like a quarter circle. You can do a little bit more than just a quarter circle, but definitely not like a half circle, because that's just not going to work. Then I would go for that third corner, fourth corner, hit enter and be done. And obviously then you can move these vertices manually. So if you are not satisfied with the resulting shape, then you can do some changes. And you can also, for example, merge the vertices together if you think that there are too many, and use all the other functions that we talked about. Unlike all the other surfaces, asphalt can be recolored. So by default it's this, and I can just put whatever color I want with the recoloring tool that we already talked about. I cannot do it for pavement, and I cannot do it for grass either, as you can see. But there is something to note here. So all of these three asphalt surfaces are at the same height. Let me actually do it. I'm going to press my Ctrl H shortcut, which I have set for aligning heights, and I'm actually going to align them to a single height. Now, this circle right here was not changed with the draw function at all. So I'm just going to move it towards that red surface, and as you can see, because they are exactly the same height, they are going to start fighting for the position of the texture, because they are different colors, of course. But watch what happens when I move it over that surface that I use the draw function for. It's not going to fight. Why? Well, because if you are going to use the draw function, then the surface is automatically going to be a tiny little bit lower. So this is really something to remember if you are, for example, trying to build surfaces where you are combining these different objects, then you are going to have these kinds of vertical offsets. It's not really a big deal. You are certainly not going to notice it visually, but maybe with pedestrians, if you like really fiddled with pedestrian paths so that pedestrians are actually touching the surface on the pedestrian paths that you put over these surfaces, invisible ones, then they might be looking with like a little bit of gap below them for this one. So it's just really something to remember. Also, if you, for example, position very, very carefully these kinds of objects, let me actually show you. So let's just say that I would like to create like a different roof, all right? And I would position super carefully this like initial object so that it perfectly touches the surface of the roof while it's still a circle. And then I wanted to match the shape, so I would go into customization, draw, and then I would start drawing the roof. And look at that. It's below the texture because it got moved slightly lower. So if this happens to you, then don't panic. All you need to do is just either manually, for example, type in some kind of a slightly larger number, and it's going to return, but it's just something to remember. Ploppable pavement works exactly the same, so there is the same limitation for stretching in the blue axis, x-axis, or the red one is without limits, as you can see, and the draw function works for the circles just like for the asphalt, but it works slightly differently for grass. So there is that same limitation for stretching in the blue axis. As you can see, it's going to start doing that weird movement and disconnect the vertices. But the red axis is with a limit. It's not really limited to just change the size, but as you can see, it's going to start displaying this shadow, and there's nothing you can do about that. So this is the physical limit, how you can stretch this initial square for the grass. So if you're trying to fill like large surfaces with grass, and it's going to require more than just one square or one rectangle, then I would highly recommend that you prepare this shape. You're just going to stretch it as much as you can, and then you are just going to copy paste it everywhere else where you want it. This exact same limitation applies to the circles for the shadows. So for example, if I'm going to click the draw and I would just like to draw it very far away in this direction, then as you can see, it is going to start displaying those shadows as well. So if you are trying to create with the circle, if you are trying to create some kind of a rectangle in this way, then as you can see, this works, but it doesn't work in this direction, okay? Like a very thin rectangle. So if you are having this problem with the initial shape, then all you can do is simply turn it, right? So if I wanted to just turn it 90 degrees, then I can easily do that for the whole object, and then I can do this very thin rectangle in this axis. The same shadow problem is also going to appear when you move even slightly. If you move one edge down, or even just one single corner down. So if you are trying to create some kind of sloped surfaces, you can only move up from the initial positions. And one thing related to colored asphalt surfaces is that when you are using the Ploppable asphalt loading time fix, I noticed that there might be a little problem that I cannot really replicate right now, but I did notice it in one of my series. It's basically related to matching surfaces that have different rotation. So if I wanted to copy paste this one and just rotate it slightly, then what I noticed, it's not really consistently done, but at some orientations it's going to slightly darken or brighten, so it's going to change shade a little bit. So when you're going to overlap them like this, it's going to be noticeable because there's going to be like a fighting for the texture. So I suppose it might be like a good practice if you are trying to fill some larger surfaces to not change the orientation, but for example, fill the surfaces like this, and if you want some kind of corners done differently in different angles, then you are just going to fiddle with the vertices of those squares that are the closest. And this only relates to the colored asphalt surfaces, so it's not a problem for pavement or grass. And now we need to talk about decals and procedural objects, because there are some specifics related to them. I already made a video about it, but it's kind of old and outdated. There are some new techniques, so let's talk about that. Alright, so we basically have like two types of decals. We have these kinds of like decorative tiles and surfaces, and then various kinds of stains, right? And I suppose that you are going to use slightly different techniques when working with them, but the procedural objects principles are applying to both, of course. So decals in city skylines are going to be displayed on surfaces like the ground. They are also going to appear on all the types of ploppable surfaces like these, and they are going to apply to networks, so any kind of roads, railways, or retaining walls, like or fences, for example, like these, as we can see. Now, conversion into procedural objects, you can do it in two basic ways, depending on the settings. So, if you go into the options of procedural objects, then by default you have this automatically resize converted decals on. I believe it is on. And what that means is that when I'm going to convert, for example, these three, I'm just going to hit Shift P with Move It. That's going to convert them into PO. And, you know, they are just going to be like that. Nothing's going to change. And then I'm going to turn the option off and convert these three. By default, they are going to disappear for some reason, but if you are just going to fiddle, if you are going to fiddle with a vertex, put it somewhere, then Control Z it back, then they are going to revert. I'm not really sure. That's probably some kind of a bug with procedural objects right now. I don't exactly remember the mod doing it like that. But anyway, you're just going to do that and it's going to be fine. Now, what is the difference between them? It has to do with the bounding box. Now, the way procedural objects work, or sorry, the decals work, is they are defined by a bounding box. So there's basically this kind of box, and the decal is displayed on the bottom, on the surface that is covered by the bounding box. So this was with the resize option off. This was with the resize option on. And as you can see, it got squashed to the surface where it was originally built. Now, what are the implications? What is the difference between these different sizes of the bounding box? Well, for example, if you are doing some kind of a plaza, and the plaza is enclosed by some kind of a network, like for example this pedestrian path, which is ever so slightly above the surface, as you can maybe tell by this little edge, then if I'm going to now position this road over the decals, then look at that. These decals are automatically going to be below the road because the bounding box is completely below the road, but these decals are going to be over it. And that's of course something that we don't want. We do want to have that edge. We do want to have those decals ending like that. So this is very, very handy tool. I was doing decal surfaces like this back in the day when this option was not available, and it was really, really painful to do every single decal. You had to change the bounding box to go below the network, and it was really, really painful. So this is really saving a lot of time. Now, just a reminder what the bounding box actually is and how it works. So, for example, if I'm going to look at the decal from the top, I am going to make the bounding box smaller like this. And when I'm looking at the decal from this direction, outside of the bounding box, then, or rather outside of the wall that I changed, then I'm actually going to see the decal cut. But if I'm going to move the camera around, then look at that. At some point, the decal is actually going to start appearing again. Why? Well, because I'm looking into the entire bounding box and I can see the entire decal. So this is of course related to the height of the bounding box. So if I then took the upper points of the bounding box and I started to move them lower, then of course at some point they are going to start going below that like viewing angle. So this is the point where I would just move it below the surface. This is just above the surface, so I cannot really see that edge that I covered with changing the size of the wall, right, of the bounding box. And this would be just me putting it above. As you can see, now that I go back to that outline, yeah, you can see that the outline is above that edge. It's a little bit difficult to imagine, but I suppose if you're going to, try it yourself, then you are going to immediately recognize how this works. So this is again where these kinds of flattened bounding boxes are super useful. So back in the day, for example, you couldn't do this. You couldn't really put a decal on some kind of elevated surface. So for example, this median, and I would really like it so it would not display under any circumstances from any kind of viewing angle. So it would not display over the road, which is lower than the median. So I would look at it from this direction, for example. I would nicely, cover this entire surface like that with the tiles. I would match it to the edge, and I would be very happy with the results. But then I would change the camera angle, and look at that. It's back where I started. So if I have a completely flat bounding box, then that's not going to happen. Otherwise, or maybe it is going to happen, but I would have to really zoom into that one specific angle, but that's never going to happen with any kind of cinematics or any kind of screenshots that I would like to be doing. So I would do just this kind of a change, and look at that. It's not going to be there. And also one thing to remember is that decal cannot be resized. You are not really going to stretch this texture. So for example, this particular one, if I take these outer edges and I'm just going to move them, then as you can see, the texture is not going to repeat or stretch or anything like that. So no matter how I change the bounding box size, the texture is always going to be the same. And this is actually kind of useful. So for example, if I want to match the texture so that it cuts like on a corner or something, then I can do these kinds of changes, right? I can, for example, do this kind of a shape so that there's going to be like a straight line, and I basically have like 5 edges instead of 4, with just these like strategic cuts like that. But the size of the bounding box has some kind of implications for fading of the decals. So if I have the bounding box completely flat, and I'm now going to go into move it, select procedural objects, and I would like to, for example, move up and down this particular one, then look at that. If I'm going to move it up, or actually down below the surface, it's immediately going to disappear. It's not going to do the fading. Why? Well, because the bounding box is completely flat, and with just touching page down with move it, I'm completely going to move it below the surface. So you don't want to really use that completely for every single decal. So for example, these kinds of stains that you would like to slightly fade out, you don't want to have that flattened bounding box. And even if the bounding box is completely flat, I can still move it above the surface, and it is going to be displayed on the surface. As you can see, the bounding box is now not touching the surface, but just like before, I'm looking into the bounding box. Therefore, the texture is displayed on the surface that is in the view below it, right? And you can actually achieve that fade out distance, which is controlled by the asset creator, or just, settings for the decal. It's not converted, it's not changed by procedural objects in any way. You cannot control it. At some angle, I'm not going to be looking into the bounding box, so I'm going to get this disappearing effect from the edges. You cannot change the sizes of the textures, but you can rotate them, and that is going to be especially useful if you want to put the decals on walls. So by default, these kinds of decals are just going to apply this really weird looking outline on any kind of any kind of vertical surfaces it's going to touch like this. But if you actually would like to put it on the wall, you can. So with Move It, using Move It, I would match the orientations, of course, that's very important. Then I would go into Procedural Objects and I would simply turn this decal 90 degrees like this. So it's going to disappear from the surface, obviously, but I can now make it appear on the wall. Look at that, just like this. And then I would be able to do all those things, like, for example, copy-paste them and match them and completely cover that surface. So this would be especially useful if I wanted to do some kind of stains on the walls. And now I can, for example, just match the orientation with that previous decal. And if I do have that non-flat bounding box, then I can simply just use this to create this like faded surface, and I can make those walls a little bit more interesting. Conversion into procedural objects is not going to change the behavior of the fighting textures. So with some angles, you might think that this is now fine, but no, you're going to find that one angle where the textures are going to start fighting. So that's why you cannot put stains over decal tiles, for example, or any kind of other details. Now, what if you have a situation where you need to fill this kind of an L shape, or maybe some kind of a circular outline or something like that? Then you have several options on how to do this. You might do it with the more obvious way. That would be, for example, to just cut the decal like this, but then you would have to cut it exactly at the seam between some kind of texture outlines. So for example, these kinds of tiles, individual tiles, then I would have to make a copy, probably something like this, cut it like this. But yeah, as you can see, there is that seam. It's not really following the same pattern and all that, so that's a bit difficult. So there is actually a little bit different way how to do this, and that is overlapping the decals. I know I said that overlapping decals is not exactly all that great, but if it's going to be decals that overlap and they are the same, then it's going to be fine, and they are the same and they are at the same position. So what I would do is I would take this decal, I would go into Move It, select it, hit Alt, click Copy button, so that it's going to create a copy exactly in its place. I would left click once, so I select only one of them. I would move that one a little tiny bit higher, and I can easily, simply cut one of them like this, so that it's going to go to this, this outline. And then I would select the other one carefully, this one, and do it like that. And look at that. Now I have perfectly matching texture. It's continuing in that L-shaped, and it's cut in this corner where I didn't want it. And if this was like a circular corner, circular outline, you would need a little bit more vertices to play with, so you can just do it how many times you want and overlap as many decals as you want. And because they are exactly in the same position horizontally, then they are not going to have that fighting for the texture. And this little overlapping trick might also work if you are dealing with some significant elevations. So for example, I would have this network that I really wanted to put some decals on, but as you can see, I cannot really do it fully because it's going to just make that decal fade out. I would play with the bounding box as well, but it's not going to really stop the fading out. So I might simply overlap the procedural objects, and I can even do it multiple times. As you can see, this is kind of required over here, and I'm just going to use, for example, 3 of them, and they are going to share the same position, so they're not going to fight with the textures. Now there is also a little bit different trick if you wanted to fill these kinds of outlines of like borders of some plazas or whatever places where you have these circular outlines. And obviously it's going to be a little bit tricky because you don't have enough vertices. So for example, if I had the decal like this, and it's like a result of some kind of detailing process, I couldn't really change the positions of the decals, then I can't do it because it's going to be overlapping into that network. Well, there is actually kind of like a lazy trick that you can do, and that is you can simply use some kind of a curb. You're going to place it there. You're going to use the node controller for that curve and just stretch it just so it's going to be enough to cover that outline. So I'm just going to overdo it to really show you what I mean. I'm just going to, with node controller, make it like 400 times as wide, and I would just put it over the corner and completely hide that inconsistent detail just like this. And of course, these kinds of decals, these kinds of tiles that have the flat bounding boxes, they absolutely need completely flat terrain. So if you have just some kind of terrain that is not flat, that's a little bit different, then those decals are usually going to completely disappear. So, and you know, in City Skylines it's not that easy to deal with flat terrain, especially if you have like some buildings around it. It might be a little bit difficult. So you can just use this brute force approach, and that is force it down with a terraforming network below the entire plaza. And these days what I'm doing is I'm simply going to take the node controller and just stretch that terraforming network to the entire area. And of course, the fact that procedural object decals do appear even on procedural object ploppable surfaces, you can just use them vertically to create some kind of basis for details on buildings. So if I wanted to, I don't know, just put some sort of a detail on the facade of this building, like a different color for some sort of element, like a sign, or you know, whatever detail that you might think of. Like for example, I would like to recolor that one pillar between the window for some reason, doesn't really matter. Then I need to prepare this kind of surface with the procedural object ploppable surface like that, and then I would just take whatever decal I want to put on it, and there we go. Now I can just create my own walls like this very easily. And also one little tip regarding the procedural objects and loading screen mod. So if you have some kind of asset missing, then loading screen mod is going to tell you that that asset is missing. You can have that log displayed and all those things. And these days, procedural objects are also going to tell you that an asset is missing. When you're going to load a save, it's going to show you like a window that there's like an asset missing. Now, if you want to have also procedural objects displayed in loading screen mod's output file, then you basically need to have a copy of a normal object of that procedural object. And the way I do it, for example, is using find it. So I would go into find it, I would enable the option to show the number of existing instances, plus include procedural objects, and then I would just do the show used assets on top. And the way this works is that, as you can see, it's going to tell you if you have it as a normal object or only as a procedural object. So for example, this decal, I have 49 instances of PO alone. So if I for some reason had this asset missing, it would not appear in the loading screen mod logs, and it would also not appear in that, I believe if you, for example, downloaded the save file and you subscribed to all the used assets, or used the loading screen mod log for the load order mod as like a template for downloading all the assets, then it would not display there, all right? And you would have it missing. So what I do is I just go to the corner of the map, and I'm just going to pick every single one of these assets that are only as procedural objects, and I would just put them here in the corner. There obviously needs to be a road here so that there would be, yeah, it's out of city limits, but you probably get the idea. So I would place the building here because it's only as PO, this building is only as PO, this ploppable asphalt is only as PO. Yeah, and every single one of these objects that are only appearing as PO in the city, I would put in here so there is a normal object copy. Okay, so that was probably all. I cannot really think of anything else I can show you for procedural objects, so this video is already super long, but well, procedural objects are kind of not really complicated, but extensive and very powerful. So, thank you for watching this tutorial. Hopefully it was helpful to you. Please do all the things for the algorithm, clicking and all that, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.